She was still wearing her wedding dress when he found her sitting alone in the dirt, mascara streaked down her face. Bouquet crushed in her hands, the church bells still echoing behind her like a cruel joke. The man she had waited for had chosen someone else's money over her heart. And now Evelyn Carter had nothing. No husband, no home, no family left in this world. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The letter arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Reverend Holt had just opened his Bible. The organ had just breathed its first note. 60 people had just turned in their pews to watch the back doors of the First Baptist Church of Raven Creek, Colorado, waiting for the bride to begin her walk. And then the messenger boy pushed through those doors instead. He was maybe 12 years old, skinny, red-faced from running. His hat clutched to his chest like he already knew what he was carrying was something terrible. He looked around the room, found the Reverend, found the waiting faces. And then his eyes landed on the woman standing at the back of the church in an ivory dress with a small crown of dried wildflowers pinned into her dark hair. He walked toward her. The organ stopped. Evelyn Carter watched the boy come down the aisle that she was supposed to walk, and she felt something cold move through her chest before he even reached her. She already knew. She didn't know how she knew. Maybe it was the way his hands were shaking. Maybe it was the look on his face, that particular look a young boy gets when an adult has given him a task too heavy for his years and told him to carry it anyway. Or maybe it was something deeper. Something in her bones that had been quietly whispering, wait for the last 3 months, ever since James Whitfield had started coming home later and talking less and touching her hand with a kind of distance that a woman feels even when a man is sitting right beside her. The boy stopped in front of her. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice cracked. "I'm real sorry, ma'am." He held out the envelope. Evelyn took it. Her hands were steady. She would remember that later, how steady her hands were in that moment, even as everything else in her world was preparing to collapse. She broke the wax seal, unfolded the single page inside. The handwriting was neat, careful, the way a man writes when he wants to appear composed while doing something cowardly. "Evelyn, I have given this considerable thought, and I believe it is better for both of us if we do not proceed with today's ceremony. I have chosen to honor a prior commitment to Miss Helena Marsh of Denver. Her family's connections will allow me opportunities I cannot afford to ignore. I hope you understand, this is a matter of practicality, not personal failing on your part. I wish you well. James." She read it once, then she read it again. Not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because some parts of the human mind refuse to accept what the eyes are already seeing, and they demand a second look, a third look, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating if you only stare long enough. They didn't. A prior commitment. A matter of practicality. Not personal failing on your part. Evelyn folded the letter, pressed it flat between her palms, and then she looked up at the 60 people watching her from the pews. She had grown up in this town. She had gone to school with some of these people. She had sat beside their mothers at church socials and helped their daughters learn to sew and brought food to their doors when illness came through in February. She knew their names. She knew their children's names. And right now, every single one of them was watching her with a mixture of pity and something she recognized too well. Relief. Relief that it was her standing here and not them. Reverend Holt stepped down from the pulpit. He was a gentle man, old and round-shouldered with white hair and the kind of voice that had comforted 1,000 people through 1,000 hard moments. "Evelyn," he said softly. "Child, why don't we step outside?" "No," she said. Her voice came out clearer than she expected, louder than she intended. The room went very still. "No," she said again, quieter this time. "I'm fine, Reverend. Thank you." She turned and walked back up the aisle. She walked the way she had practiced for this day, straight back, chin level, one foot in front of the other. The only difference was she was walking out instead of in, and there was no music, and the man waiting at the end of the aisle was absent instead of present. She pushed through the church doors. She walked out into the afternoon light, and she kept walking until the church was behind her, and the sounds of Raven Creek faded, and there was nothing around her but the open road and the dry Colorado wind pulling at her hair and the distant mountains that had always made her feel small in a way that was somehow comforting. She walked until her legs gave out, and then she sat down in the dirt beside the road. She sat there in her ivory dress, the dress she had repaired herself stitch by stitch over 3 long evenings, because she couldn't afford a new one, and she looked out at nothing and let the afternoon pass around her. She did not cry, not because she wasn't broken, but because she was calculating. The way a person calculates when they have hit the very bottom, and they must think clearly, or drown. What do I have? She went through it in her mind. Her father, Thomas Carter, had died the previous December. A hard winter, a bad chest, and a body that had simply worn itself out after 58 years of hard work. He had gone quietly in his sleep, and Evelyn had held his hand as he went, and she had been grateful for that small mercy, even in the middle of her grief. But the farm her father had worked his whole life, the farm where she had been born, where she had learned to walk and talk and love the smell of early morning soil, that farm had been sold 3 weeks after his death to cover the debts he had quietly accumulated over his last 2 struggling years. She had known, even as she signed the papers transferring the deed, that she was also signing away the last place in the world where she had a right to stand. James Whitfield had proposed 2 months after her father died. She had told herself it was love. She had almost believed it. But standing here now in the dirt beside the road in her second-hand wedding dress, she could see the truth clearly for the first time. She had accepted James Whitfield's proposal because she was 29 years old and alone and frightened, and he had offered her something she needed more desperately than affection. He had offered her a roof, a place to belong, a future that had a shape, and she had dressed that need up in the language of romance and told herself it was something more dignified because that was easier to live with. Now the need was bare and ugly and real. She had no money. She had a small trunk of belongings stored at the church, a wedding dress she was currently sitting in the dirt in, and 43 cents in a small cloth purse tucked into her bodice. 43 cents. No father, no mother. Her mother had died when Evelyn was 11. No siblings. No cousins close enough to matter. No house, no farm, no claim on any piece of this earth. She sat there and felt the full weight of that emptiness press down on her. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to feel truly afraid. Not the quiet, anxious fear she had been managing for months, but the real kind. The kind that lives in the stomach and climbs into the throat. The kind that says you are alone, and you have nothing, and there is no floor beneath you. The sun moved lower. The shadows grew longer. A hawk drifted in slow circles overhead. Evelyn sat in the dirt and breathed. She didn't hear the horse until it was close. She didn't look up right away. She assumed it was someone from town coming to offer her sympathy, and she wasn't ready for sympathy. Sympathy right now would undo her completely, and she couldn't afford to come undone. Not yet. But the horse stopped, and the rider didn't speak immediately. She looked up. The man sitting on the brown horse was not someone she would have called a friend exactly. More of a familiar face. The kind of man a small town knows without really knowing, a figure you see at the feed store at the church twice a year on holidays, occasionally at the post office collecting whatever arrived on the monthly supply wagon. Nathan Cole. He was 36 years old, though he looked older in the way men who work outside in all weathers tend to look older. Not aged exactly, but weathered. Settled into himself. His jaw was square and covered in several days' growth, and his dark hair curled slightly at his temples under the brim of a hat that had seen better years. He had gray eyes. She noticed that now because she had never been close enough to notice before. He was looking at her the way you look at something unexpected, not with pity, not with judgment. With a kind of quiet recognition. Like a man who has seen something like this before. like a man who has sat somewhere like this himself. He took off his hat. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Cole." Her voice was flat. Not rude, just empty. He didn't say "I'm sorry," or "I heard what happened," or "what a shame," or any of the things she was braced for. He sat on his horse for a moment and looked at her, and then he looked at the road, and then he looked back at her. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked. The question was simple, direct, no ornament to it. She could have lied. A prideful woman would have lied. She could have said yes, she had a plan. She was fine, she didn't need anyone's concern. But the 43 cents in her bodice made lying feel like a luxury she couldn't afford. "No," she said. Nathan turned his hat in his hands. Once. Twice. "My ranch is about 4 miles north," he said. "Up toward the ridge. There's a room that hasn't been used in a couple of years. It's clean. There's a kitchen. I've got more work than I can manage alone and not enough money to hire properly." He paused. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering fair work and a place to sleep. You'd have your own room, your own key. Nobody in this town would have any business knowing what arrangements you choose to make." Evelyn stared at him. He held her gaze steadily. "There's no debt in it," he said. "If you decide tomorrow morning it was a mistake, I'll drive you back to town myself. No argument." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the thing she expected to find there, the angle, the advantage, the hidden price tag that would reveal itself later. She didn't find it. She didn't know if that meant it wasn't there or if she was too exhausted to see it. She stood up from the dirt. She brushed off her dress. She looked at Nathan Cole and said, "All right." He had a wagon waiting on the far side of the rise. He'd come into town for supplies and was heading back. He helped her retrieve the small trunk from the church without going inside, setting it in the wagon bed without comment. They rode for 4 miles in near silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Something different. The kind of quiet that exists between two people who are both dealing with something they don't have words for yet. Halfway up the ridge road, Evelyn said, "Why? Why what?" Nathan said, "Why offer a stranger a room in your house?" He kept his eyes on the road ahead. The horse's ears moved slowly, tracking sounds she couldn't hear. "I don't entirely know," he said finally. "But I've sat beside that same road in a different way. And someone didn't keep riding. So." He shrugged slightly. "I didn't keep riding." Evelyn absorbed that. "Who didn't keep riding?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My wife's father," he said. "When I was 22 and had nothing. He didn't keep riding." She waited, but he didn't say anything more, and she understood from the set of his jaw and the way the muscle in his cheek moved once and then went still that the rest of that story was one he wasn't ready to tell to a woman he'd known for 4 miles. She let it go. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The ranch house was not what she expected. She had built a picture in her mind during the ride, a man living alone for years, a house that had shrunk into itself, that smelled of neglect and old meals and the particular staleness of rooms without women in them. Instead, the house was clean. Spare, but clean. The floors were swept. The windows weren't clouded with grime. There were no dishes piled in the sink. The kitchen table had one chair pulled out at an angle, as though someone had just stood up from it. But there were other signs. The curtains in the front room were faded, nearly colorless. They had once been green, she thought, or maybe blue. The porch railing had a long crack running through it that had been wrapped with wire rather than repaired properly. In the kitchen, a shelf held a collection of jars and tins that someone had once arranged neatly, but had gradually been rearranged through use until they stood in disorder. It was a house that had once been cared for and was now simply maintained. There was a difference. She felt it in the air. Nathan showed her the room at the end of the hall. Small. A narrow bed with a wool blanket. A window that looked out over the back field. A wooden chair. a hook on the back of the door for hanging clothes. "Wash basins down the hall," he said. "Water pumps outside the kitchen. I eat at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. If you'd rather cook for yourself, that's your choice." "And the work," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Tonight, you rest." He left her alone. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in her wedding dress and looked at the wall. She was in a stranger's house, 4 miles from a town that was currently buzzing with the story of her humiliation. Wearing borrowed to herself ivory silk in a room that smelled like cedar and old wool. She should have felt more afraid, but the strange thing was, and she would turn this over in her mind for weeks afterward trying to understand it, she felt something closer to stillness. Not peace, not happiness, but stillness, like the bottom of a deep well. Like something that had been falling, had finally landed, and now the question was not how to stop the fall, but what to do next. She reached up and carefully removed the crown of dried wildflowers from her hair. She set it on the wooden chair. She looked at it for a moment. And then she lay down on the narrow bed in her wedding dress, pulled the wool blanket over herself, and went to sleep. Morning came early and cold. Evelyn was awake before the sun cleared the ridge, which was not unusual. She had always been an early riser, trained by years of farm life into an internal clock that refused to respect comfort or convenience. She dressed in the plain brown work dress she found folded in her trunk, packed by her own hands 3 days ago for the honeymoon journey, and stepped out into the kitchen. Nathan was already there. He was standing at the stove and he had made coffee. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Coffee," he said. Not a question. A statement offered. "Thank you," she said. She took the cup he poured and stood at the kitchen window while he went back to whatever he'd been working on, something with a piece of leather harness that he was stitching at the table. They didn't talk for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was actually something she noticed as strange in a good way, how a person could stand in a stranger's kitchen in the early morning light and feel the silence as something almost companionable rather than cold. After a while, she said, "What would you like me to do today?" He looked up. He seemed to consider her for a moment, taking inventory. She thought the way a person does when they're trying to assess what someone is genuinely capable of versus what they claim. "The garden out back," he said. "It's gone to weeds. Haven't touched it in 2 years. There's a vegetable patch in there somewhere if you can find it. I can find it. There's also about 60 feet of fence line along the north pasture that needs new posts. I can't do both today. Show me where the tools are," she said. Something moved in his face, not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. "You know how to set fence posts," he said. "My father taught me to do everything on a farm that needed doing," she said. "He didn't have sons." Nathan put down the harness. "Follow me," he said. She worked for 9 hours that day. She cleared 3/4 of the garden, hauling out weeds by the root, discovering the remnants of what had once been an ambitious vegetable plot. Tomato cages still standing, beans long dead and dry on their poles, a row of what might have been herbs, now gone to seed and chaos. There was also a rose bush along the south wall of the house, ancient, gnarled, overgrown into a shape more wild than cultivated, but alive, genuinely, stubbornly alive. She pruned it carefully, more carefully than she pruned anything else that day. In the afternoon, she found Nathan fixing the fence at the far end of the north pasture. She had finished the garden ahead of what he'd expected, so she walked out to the pasture and picked up a spare post driver without asking and started working on the next section. He looked at her from the corner of his eye. He didn't say anything, but a little while later, when they stopped to rest and he poured water from his canteen, he handed it to her first. It was such a small thing, but she noticed it. Key. At dinner that evening, simple food, beans and salt pork and cornbread, they talked more than she expected. Not about important things at first. About the garden, about which sections of the fence still needed attention, about whether the soil in the east corner of the vegetable patch had enough drainage. Practical things. the language of shared work. But then, mid-meal, Nathan put down his fork and looked at her directly. "People in town are going to talk," he said. "I know," she said. "It's going to be worse than what they're already saying." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "Does that bother you?" Evelyn considered the question seriously, not defensively. "It bothers me," she said, "the way a headache bothers you. It's real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But it's not going to change what I decide to do." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "What do you decide to do?" he asked. "Long term. Have you thought about it?" "I've been thinking about it since yesterday afternoon," she said. "I don't have many options. I could try to find work in Raven Creek. The schoolhouse needs someone in the fall maybe, and Mrs. Albright at the millinery sometimes takes on help. But boarding costs money I don't have, and most of the families in this town have already formed an opinion about me that won't help me get hired." She cut another piece of cornbread. "Or I could stay here," she said. "If you'll have me, earn my room, build something that doesn't depend on anyone feeling sorry for me." "I told you there's no debt," he said. "I know what you told me," she said. "And I heard you, but I'm not built for taking without giving. So if I stay, I'm going to work. That's not negotiable." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork again. "All right," he said. "You what?" 3 weeks passed, then 6. The garden came back. Not overnight. Nothing real ever happens overnight, but steadily, the way living things recover when they're given the right conditions. Green shoots appeared in the tomato bed. The bean poles filled in. The herbs which she had suspected were past saving pushed out new growth that surprised her. And the rose bush along the south wall of the house began to bud. Nathan didn't comment on this, but she caught him looking at it one morning from the porch, with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between recognition and pain. She stored the observation away and didn't ask. There were other changes, smaller ones. The curtains in the front room were replaced. She had found a bolt of simple blue cotton in the back of the cedar chest in the hall closet, still wrapped, never used, and she had cut and hemmed it in an evening without mentioning it to Nathan. He walked into the front room the next morning and stopped for a moment in the doorway. He didn't say anything about it. But that evening at dinner, he asked her how she took her coffee. She blinked at him. "You've been making my coffee every morning for 6 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been guessing. Seems like it's worth asking properly." She felt something warm move through her chest. Something small and specific and real. "Half as strong as you make it," she said. "With a spoon of molasses if you have it." He nodded. The next morning, her coffee was exactly that. It was Mrs. Eleanor Briggs who fired the first shot. Eleanor Briggs was 60 years old, well-positioned, and had been the unofficial arbiter of Raven Creek's social standards for the last 20 years. She wore her authority the way other women wore perfume, omnipresent, impossible to ignore, applied a little too heavily. She appeared at the ranch on a Tuesday morning, driving her own small buggy, wearing a hat with more structure than a building. Evelyn was in the garden when she heard wheels on the road. She stood, shaded her eyes with her hand, and watched Eleanor Briggs navigate the gate latch with an expression of mild affront, as though the gate itself had been rude to her. Nathan was out at the far pasture. Evelyn was alone at the house. She pulled off her garden gloves, tucked them in her apron pocket, and walked to meet the woman. "Mrs. Briggs," she said. Neutral. Polite. "Miss Carter." Eleanor Briggs looked her over the work dress, the dirt on her apron, the state of her hair pinned back against the wind. Evelyn could see her cataloging each point. "I'll be plain," Eleanor Briggs said. "I've known Nathan Cole since he was a boy. His mother was a dear friend of mine before she passed. I feel a responsibility to his reputation." "I see," Evelyn said. "People are talking. People have been talking since the day I sat down beside that road." Evelyn said. "They were talking before I sat down. This is different." Eleanor Briggs squared her shoulders. An unmarried woman living in a man's household is not something this community takes lightly. I'm asking you for Nathan's sake, if not your own, to consider what you're doing to his standing." Evelyn looked at this woman. She felt the words rising in her, the sharp ones, the ones that would feel satisfying for about 30 seconds, and would then make things considerably worse. She felt them rise, and she pushed them back down. "Mrs. Briggs," she said evenly, "I was left with nothing and nowhere to go. Mr. Cole offered honest work and a fair room. I have my own key. I cook and I clean and I work that garden and I fix his fence line and I earn my place here every single day. If this community has a problem with a woman working for her own survival, I'm afraid that problem belongs to the community." She paused. "But I appreciate your concern for Mr. Cole," she added. "He's earned it." Eleanor Briggs stood very still. Whatever she had expected from the abandoned bride, tears perhaps, or pleading, or the kind of collapsed deference that people sometimes mistake for dignity, she had not expected this. She adjusted her hat slightly. "I see," she said finally. She got back in her buggy. She left. Evelyn went back to her garden. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed this pressed them flat against the soil for a moment and breathed. She pulled weeds for another hour. When Nathan came back from the pasture in late afternoon, and she told him about Eleanor Briggs' visit matter-of-factly without drama, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. "What did you say to her?" he asked. Evelyn told him. He was quiet. Then he said, "How did she take it?" "I honestly couldn't tell," Evelyn said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Almost. Eleanor Briggs hasn't left a conversation without the last word in 40 years, he said. "Apparently today she did," Evelyn said. And that time Nathan Cole actually smiled. It was a brief thing, narrow and careful, like a man who hadn't smiled in a while and wasn't entirely sure the muscles still knew how. But it was real. Evelyn turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her reaction to it, but she was glad she had seen it. The first time she found Nathan standing in the doorway of the room at the end of the West Hall, she almost walked past without speaking. She had been heading to the linen closet, and he was simply standing there, door open, not inside, just standing in the doorway still, and looking at something she couldn't see from where she stood in the hall. She stopped. "Nathan," she said gently. He didn't startle exactly, more like he returned from somewhere. He pulled the door mostly closed. "Sorry," he said. "You don't need to be sorry," she said. "Is that?" She stopped. She didn't want to assume. Whose room was it? He was quiet for a moment. "My wife's," he said. "Margaret." She had heard the name once or twice in town. Margaret Cole. She had died. Evelyn didn't know the details, and now wasn't the moment to ask. "Was she the one who planted the garden?" Evelyn asked instead. He looked at her, and the look on his face was careful and complicated. "Yes," he said. "And the rose bush," Evelyn said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "I'll make sure the rose bush comes through the summer," she said. "I'm not going to let it die." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, something she couldn't name, something that moved through his gray eyes like weather moving across a high plain. "Thank you," he said. It was a small exchange. 10 seconds, maybe 15, but Evelyn felt it settle into the walls of that house like the first nail driven into real foundation. She heard the horse coming fast down the ridge road at just past noon on a Friday in late August. She was on the porch repairing a section of screen door that had split along the bottom seam. She stood up and shaded her eyes. A rider. Coming at a pace that meant something urgent. She watched him come through the gate, and as he got closer, she felt something in her stomach turn cold. Not because she recognized the horse, but because she recognized the posture of the man on it, the way James Whitfield sat. A horse slightly too upright, shoulders pulled back a degree too far. The posture of a man performing confidence rather than possessing it was something she had known for 2 years. It was written in her body in the way that intimate daily knowledge always is. She did not move from the porch. She set down her tools. She stood and waited while James Whitfield rode across the yard and pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet from where she stood. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had the good sense, at least, to look somewhat ashamed. The lines around his mouth were different than she remembered, deeper somehow, or arranged differently. He held his hat in both hands, which was a gesture she had never seen from him before. "Evelyn," he said. "James," she said. Her voice gave nothing away. She had not planned for this moment, had not imagined it, had not rehearsed a speech, had not spent sleepless nights imagining what she would say to him if he came. She had spent her sleepless nights doing the arithmetic of survival instead. How many jars she could put up before winter? Whether the income from the work she was doing, plus what Nathan paid her in a small monthly amount, would add up to enough to matter. Whether the east field could support a second planting of winter squash. She had not spent them thinking about James Whitfield, which was, she now realized, its own kind of answer. "I wanted to see you," he said. "You're seeing me," she said. He glanced at the porch, the repaired screen door, the evidence of her hands on this place. "They told me you were living here," he said. "I am. Evelyn." "Be careful what you say next," she said quietly. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "Be very careful, James, because whatever you came here to say, I need you to understand something first. I am not the woman who was sitting beside that road 2 months ago. Not in the way that matters. So whatever speech you prepared on the ride out here, I need you to think about whether it's actually true or whether you came out here because Helena Marsh's family refused you after all." James Whitfield's face went through several changes in rapid succession. She watched each one. Shame, calculation. Something that might have been genuine remorse, or might have been its cousin regret, which is a different thing entirely, because regret is mostly about what you lost, and remorse is about what you did. She watched his face and tried to tell the difference. She honestly couldn't. "I made a mistake," he said. "The worst kind. I know that." "Do you?" she said. "Evelyn, please." "I'm not angry with you," she said. He blinked. "I was," she said. "I sat beside that road and I let myself be angry, and then I let it go because I couldn't afford it. I don't have the luxury of anger anymore. I'm too busy." She picked up her tools from the porch railing. "You should go home, James," she said. "And when you get there, you should ask yourself a very honest question. Not, do I want Evelyn back, but why do I want her back? And if the answer has anything to do with comfort or convenience, or what you need, then you have your answer about who you are, and you should be honest enough to live with it." She turned back to the screen door. "And if the answer is something else," she said without looking at him, "then you should learn to be the kind of man that answer requires. And maybe someday that'll matter to someone." She heard him sit on his horse for a long moment. Then she heard the horse turn. Then she heard hoofbeats moving away. She kept her hands steady on the screen door. She kept her breathing even, and she did not look back. Nathan had seen the rider from the north pasture. He came back to the house earlier than usual, which she noticed, but he didn't explain. At dinner he said, "Was that Whitfield?" "Yes," she said. "What did he want?" She looked across the table at him. At the gray eyes and the jaw that held tension, it would never fully release, and the hands that had made themselves useful for so many years, they had forgotten how to be still. "What they always want when they realize they made a mistake," she said. "To pretend they can undo it." "And," Nathan said. "And no," she said. He picked up his fork. "Good," he said. It was one word. But the way he said it, quiet, flat, certain, like something decided, landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She thought about it later, lying in her narrow bed in her room at the end of the hall, looking at the ceiling while the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds. She thought about the word good and the way he had said it. She thought about the fact that this strange man, this stubborn, quiet, complicated man, who stood in doorways and smiled like smiling, was something he had to remember to do, had looked across a table at her, and said good, in a tone that meant more than the word itself. And she thought about how for the first time, in as long as she could remember, she was lying in a room that had started to feel like hers. Not because her name was on the deed, but because she had earned her place in it. Board by board, row by row, day by day. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the mountain pines and the ranch was quiet, and somewhere along the south wall of the house, a rose bush was preparing to bloom. And somewhere along the south wall of the house, a rose bush was preparing to bloom. And Evelyn Carter, who had arrived at this ranch with nothing but 43 cents and a borrowed wedding dress, was beginning to understand that the hardest thing about starting over was not the work itself, but learning to trust that the ground beneath your feet was actually going to hold. September came in without warning. One morning the air simply changed. The light shifted from the heavy gold of late summer into something thinner and more honest, and the mountains to the north showed their first white at the peaks. Evelyn noticed it when she went to the pump for the morning water, and felt the cold move through her sleeves in a way it hadn't managed before. Inside, Nathan was already at the stove. He handed her a cup without looking up. She wrapped both hands around it and said, "First frost in a week, maybe 2. 8 days, he said. Maybe less. I've been watching the elk." She raised an eyebrow at that. "They moved down from the upper ridge 3 days ago," he said. "They always know before the instruments do." It was the longest sentence he had said to her before 7 in the morning since she'd arrived, and she filed it away without comment, the way she had learned to file away all the small pieces of Nathan Cole, storing them carefully, making no sudden moves the way you approach an animal that has been hurt before and will bolt at the wrong gesture. "We need to get the root vegetables in," she said. "The beets and the carrots, and there's enough on the bean plants for 2 or 3 more jars if I move fast." "I know," he said. "I'll start today after the fence work." He looked at her then, the direct look he had, not unkind, but measuring the look of a man trying to determine how much weight something can bear. "You're not obligated to do all of it yourself," he said. "I know that too," she said. They ate in the comfortable quiet that had built itself between them over these weeks. Not silence exactly, but the particular peace of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill space with noise and have started simply sharing it instead. It was, Evelyn thought, more companionable than most conversations she'd had in her life, and it scared her more than she wanted to admit. Not the man, not the quiet, but the fact that she had started to depend on it. Started to feel the weight of the morning differently on the days when Nathan left before she was up. Started to listen without meaning to for the sound of his boots on the porch steps in the evening. She didn't examine this too closely. She had learned in the months since her father died and the farm was sold, and James Whitfield's letter arrived at the altar, that some feelings were best approached sideways. Head on, they had a way of turning into grief or want or longing before you could get a proper look at them, and none of those things were useful right now. Useful was what she needed to be. Useful was what she was. She took her cup and went to start the day. She was halfway through the garden when Dorothy Marsh came through the gate. Evelyn heard the latch and turned, expecting one of the neighboring ranch hands, or possibly the boy from town who sometimes brought the mail. Instead, she saw a woman she recognized from church, mid-30s, plain-faced, pleasant in the particular way of women who have decided pleasantness is a form of armor. Dorothy Marsh was the sister-in-law of Helena Marsh, which made her, in the architecture of small-town social politics, something between a spy and a messenger. Evelyn stood up from the garden row and pulled off one glove. "Mrs. Marsh," she said. "Miss Carter." Dorothy Marsh stopped a polite distance from the garden edge and looked around the yard with the bright cataloging interest of someone memorizing details to report later. "My, you've done wonders with this garden. I remember when it was well." "Can I help you with something?" Evelyn said. Dorothy Marsh's pleasant expression held. "I was passing and thought I'd stop to check on you, I suppose. We've all been wondering how you're getting along." "I'm getting along fine," Evelyn said. "Yes." Another look around the yard. "I'm sure you are. Nathan's place certainly seems to be benefiting from the arrangement." There it was. The particular way she said arrangement, not quite a sneer, but close enough that you could trace the outline of one underneath the politeness. Evelyn set her garden glove on the fence post and looked at Dorothy Marsh directly. "Say what you came to say, Mrs. Marsh," she said. "I have a lot of ground to cover today." Dorothy Marsh's pleasant expression flickered. Then she seemed to decide that directness was the more efficient route. "Helena's family is asking questions," she said. About whether there's something between you and Nathan Cole that goes beyond working arrangements." Evelyn stared at her. "Helena Marsh," she said carefully, "is the woman whose family James Whitfield chose over me." "Yes." "And now her family is asking questions about whether the woman he left at the altar has found a new what exactly?" "I'm just carrying the message," Dorothy said, and the pleasantness had mostly gone, now replaced by something more genuine, which was nervousness. "I didn't want to come here, but Helena's mother specifically." "Tell Helena's mother," Evelyn said, "that I am working on a ranch, earning my living minding my own business, and that her family's interest in my affairs is neither warranted nor welcome." She picked her glove back up. "And tell her, if she has concerns about James Whitfield, she might direct them to James Whitfield, instead of to the woman he abandoned." Dorothy Marsh stood for a moment in the kind of paralyzed stillness that comes when someone has prepared for several possible conversations and found themselves in none of them. "Of course," she said finally. Yes. Good day, Miss Carter." "Good day," Evelyn said. She went back to the garden. Her jaw was tight, and she was pulling weeds with more force than the weeds strictly required, and she made herself slow down and breathe, because she knew from experience that anger taken out on plants was anger wasted, and she had carrots to harvest before the frost. She was still in the garden when she heard Nathan's boots on the yard behind her. She didn't turn around. "That was Dorothy Marsh," she said. "I saw her buggy," he said. He came to stand at the garden edge. What did she want? Evelyn sat back on her heels. She thought about how to answer this, whether to simplify it, whether to give him the stripped-down version that left out the embarrassing parts. She decided against it. Simplifying the truth was a kind of lying, and she had promised herself she wouldn't do that here. She told him exactly what Dorothy Marsh had said. All of it. When she finished, Nathan was quiet. "Helena Marsh's mother," he said. "Yes. She sent Dorothy Marsh out here to warn you off. Check the territory." "I think she wanted to know if there was something between us that complicated James's situation," Evelyn said. "If he wants to make another run at Helena's family, he probably needs the story of the abandoned bride to stay small and tragic and finished. A woman who moved into a rancher's house and seems to be doing fine complicates the narrative." Nathan looked at her. "That's a very calm way to analyze your own humiliation," he said. "I've had time to practice," she said. He looked away. His jaw moved slightly in the way she had come to understand meant he was deciding something, choosing between saying what he thought and keeping it contained. He said it. If people are going to talk anyway, and they are, and if Whitfield's social maneuvering is already making your name part of his story. He stopped. Looked back at her. "You should know that whatever they say about you here, it's not something that changes how this household operates. What you do here is real work. What you earn here is real standing. The rest is other people's noise." She looked up at him. He said it as a matter of fact. Flat. The way he said most true things. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Turned to go back to the barn. "Nathan," she said. He stopped. "The rose bush," she said. "Margaret's rose bush. It's going to need to be covered before the frost. I'll need something old burlap or a wooden frame." He turned back slowly. "There's burlap in the barn loft," he said. "I'll find it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that complicated, careful expression she was learning to read, the one that lived in the space between what he felt and what he allowed himself to say. "She would have liked you," he said. "Margaret." He went back to the barn before she could respond. Evelyn stayed in the garden with the words sitting in the air around her. She pressed her hands into the soil, and for the first time in a very long time, She thought she might actually cry. She didn't. But it was closer than it had been in months. The root vegetables came in that afternoon. She jarred the last of the beans by lamplight. That evening, her hair tied back her apron, stained her hands sore in the good way they got when the work had been real. Nathan came in from the barn at 9 and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the rows of filled jars cooling on the counter. He didn't say anything, but he stood there for a long moment before going to bed, and the look on his face was not one Evelyn could name, but she thought the closest word might have been something like, not gratitude exactly. Something older than gratitude. Something that had to do with the sudden unwanted recognition that a thing you had stopped expecting could still arrive. The frost came on the 9th day. Not the killing kind, just the gentle warning frost. The kind that turns the window glass white at the edges and makes the pump handle cold in a way that bites into the palm. Evelyn covered the rose bush the evening before with the burlap from the barn loft. She built a careful frame from the extra fence stakes Nathan showed her where to find, and she wrapped the whole thing with a methodical thoroughness that she knew was probably more than the plant required, but she wanted to be certain. Nathan stood on the back porch and watched her. When she finished and stood back to look at her work, she heard him say from the porch, "You could have just mounded soil around the base." "I know," she said, "but this is better." A pause. "Yes," he said. "It is." She came up the porch steps past him, and they stood for a moment side by side looking at the wrapped rosebush in the near dark. "Tell me about her," Evelyn said. She had not planned to say it. It came out directly without the careful framing she would have chosen if she'd been thinking about it. Nathan was still for so long that she thought he was going to refuse. Then he said, "She came out here from St. Louis when she was 24. Her brother had staked a claim on the ridge, and she came out to help him establish it. I was hired hand then, working for a ranch 3 miles east." He stopped, started again. "I was not easy to know," he said. "I want you to understand that. I had grown up in a way that didn't teach me much about being present for people. Being open." She found that funny at first, the way I was. She'd say I was like a door that had been nailed shut, and she was just going to have to find which nail was loose. Evelyn smiled at that privately facing forward. "She found it," he said. "Quiet. Fever," he said. "The summer of '82. It moved through fast. A lot of people in the valley that year. She was sick for 11 days and then she was gone." He said it the way you state a fact you have stated so many times. It has worn smooth in the telling, all the jagged edges polished down into something you can hold without cutting yourself. But underneath the smoothness, Evelyn could hear what it cost him. "4 years ago," she said. 4 years, 3 months, he said. Which I know sounds like a man who's counting, and I suppose I am. "There's nothing wrong with counting," she said. He looked at her then, sideways. The lamp from inside the window lit the planes of his face from one angle and left the other in shadow. "No," he said. "I suppose there isn't." They stood there another moment. Then he said, "Better get in. Cold coming up fast." He went inside. Evelyn stood on the porch for another few seconds, looking at the covered rosebush, thinking about a woman she had never met who had found the loose nail in a door that had been shut for years. She thought, "I understand you, Margaret. I think I understand exactly what you saw in him." Then she went inside and shut the door behind her. The first serious trouble came in October, and it didn't come from town gossip or visiting women with well-aimed questions. It came from a man named Roy Cathcart, who owned the parcel of land that abutted Nathan's eastern fence line and had been looking for a reason to push that line 20 feet west for as long as anyone in Raven Creek could remember. Cathcart was large-loud and operated on the assumption that volume was the same thing as authority, a confusion that had served him surprisingly well in this territory. He rode onto Nathan's land on a Thursday morning while Nathan was in town at the bank, which Evelyn suspected was not a coincidence. She was on the porch when he came through the gate. She had never met Roy Cathcart, but she recognized the type immediately, the way a woman who has grown up navigating men with large egos and small patience learns to recognize the silhouette of trouble before it announces itself. He pulled his horse up in the yard and looked at her with the deliberate slowness of a man who wants you to understand he doesn't take you seriously. "Cole around," he said. "Mr. Cole is in town," she said. "May I help you?" His eyes moved over her in the assessing way she disliked. "You must be the church bride," he said. "I must be," she said evenly. "Tell Cole I was here. Tell him I've had a survey done on the eastern line, and I'll be needing him to move his fence posts. He's running about 22 feet over the legal boundary." Evelyn looked at him. "That eastern fence has been in the same position for 15 years, she said. "I've seen the property documents. They're in the desk in the front room. Mr. Cole holds the deed to everything east of Cutter's Creek, which puts those fence posts well inside his legal land." Roy Cathcart blinked. Whatever he had expected to encounter at Nathan Cole's ranch, a docile housekeeper, a quiet woman who'd nod and pass along the message, this was not it. "You've seen the documents," he said. "I keep Mr. Cole's accounts and records," she said. "I have seen every document on this property, and I would suggest, Mr. Cathcart, that before you engage a surveyor whose results conveniently favor your position, you retain a county surveyor to conduct an independent measurement. If you'd like, I can write down the county assessor's name for you." Cathcart's face went through a color change. "The county assessor," he said flatly. "His name is Frederick Bloom. He's been in the position for 11 years and has no particular interest in either your land or Mr. Cole's, which makes him ideally suited for impartial measurement." There was a long silence. "You are a piece of work," Cathcart said finally. "I've been told," she said. He wheeled his horse. "Tell Cole I'll be back." "I'll tell him exactly what you said," she replied, word for word. He rode out of the gate without looking back. Evelyn's heart was hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, but she stood on the porch until he was out of sight before she sat down on the top step and pressed her hands against her knees and made herself breathe slowly. She was not afraid of Roy Cathcart, but she understood that she had just made an enemy of him, and that enemies had a way of turning small complications into large ones. When Nathan came back from town that afternoon, she told him everything again, word for word, and again without simplifying. He stood in the kitchen and listened to all of it. Then he said, "How do you know about Cutter's Creek?" "I've been walking the property lines," she said, "to understand the lay of the land. I found the boundary markers on the east side 2 weeks ago and matched them to the deed description." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been studying my property records," he said. "I work here," she said. "I thought it was useful to understand what I'm working with." "It is useful," he said. And then, in a tone that wasn't quite wonder, but was close enough that she felt it warm her, extremely useful. "What will you do about Cathcart?" she said. "Write to Frederick Bloom first thing tomorrow," he said. "Request the county survey before Cathcart gets his fraudulent one on the record." "That's what I would do," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." She turned back to the stove to hide the thing that was happening in her face, which was not quite a smile, but required the same muscles. Behind her, Nathan Cole said, "Evelyn." She turned. He was looking at her with that direct, gray-eyed gaze that never quite did what you expected it to do. "Thank you," he said. "It's my job," she said. "No," he said. "It's more than that, and we both know it." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You're welcome," and went back to the stove. The county surveyor came out 3 weeks later and confirmed what the original deed stated. The eastern fence posts were sitting exactly where they had always been, 22 feet inside Nathan Cole's legal property line. Frederick Bloom filed his report with the county assessor's office with the methodical efficiency of a man who does not enjoy being beaten to the punch by independent surveyors hired by people with questionable motives. Roy Cathcart did not come back, but the news that Nathan Cole's hired woman had sent him off the property with a legal reference and a polite dismissal traveled through Raven Creek with the particular speed reserved for stories that subvert expectations. Evelyn heard it second and third hand in the dry goods store where she went twice a month, In the careful way the clerk looked at her while measuring out her flour, as though trying to reconcile the story with the quiet woman in the brown dress standing in front of him. She didn't comment on any of it. She bought her flour. She bought her salt. She settled the account. She went home. But Eleanor Briggs was waiting outside the dry goods store. Evelyn almost walked past her. Almost. "Miss Carter," Eleanor said. She stopped, turned. Eleanor Briggs looked different today. The commanding hat was present, but something in her posture was less armored than the last time they'd spoken. She looked like a woman who had been rethinking something and was not entirely comfortable with the conclusion she'd reached. "I want to," Eleanor started, stopped. "I owe you something of an apology." Evelyn studied her. "I came to Nathan's ranch with the intention of protecting him," Eleanor said. "And what I actually did was assume the worst about you. That was wrong of me." Evelyn waited to see if there was more. "I've heard how you managed the Cathcart business," Eleanor said, "and I've spoken with the Reverend, and with Mary Ellen Potter, whose fence line was also being challenged by Cathcart's surveyor, and whose situation has now been protected because the county record is clear largely thanks to what you did." She drew a breath. "You're not what I thought you were." "What did you think I was?" Evelyn asked. Eleanor Briggs held her gaze steadily. It took courage, Evelyn thought, for a woman of Eleanor's position to answer that question honestly. "A disaster waiting to happen," Eleanor said. "A woman in a desperate situation who would create complications for a man I care about." "And now," Evelyn said, "now I think you may be the best thing that has happened to Nathan Cole in 4 years," Eleanor said. "And I think you know that, which means you're also the most dangerous, because the kind of strength you have tends to frighten men who've gotten used to managing alone." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. "He's not frightened," she said, carefully. "Not of you," Eleanor said. "Of what caring about you would cost him. That's a different thing." They looked at each other for a moment across the packed earth street of Raven Creek. "You loved Margaret too," Evelyn said. "She was like a daughter to me," Eleanor said. The plainness of it was devastating. "Which is why I'm standing here now saying what I said before was wrong, because Margaret would have agreed with me, and she'd have told me to go find you and fix it." Evelyn looked at this woman, 60 years old, stiff-backed, powerful, standing outside the dry goods store, apologizing to a woman she'd come to dismiss 2 months before. "Would you like to have coffee sometime, Mrs. Briggs?" Evelyn asked. Eleanor Briggs' expression did something unexpected. It softened. "I would," she said. "Saturday morning," Evelyn said. "The ranch, 9 o'clock. "I'll bring cake," Eleanor said. "Don't," Evelyn said. "I'll bake." Eleanor Briggs almost smiled. "Yes," she said. "I imagine you will. Saturday morning." Eleanor Briggs arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, with her hat and her posture and a slightly more human expression than Evelyn had previously seen on her face. They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee, Evelyn's coffee, proper and strong, and talked for 2 hours. Not about Nathan, not about James Whitfield, about Raven Creek, about the town's history, about Eleanor's friendship with Nathan's mother Ruth, about the winter of 1879, when the snow came so fast and deep that the whole valley was cut off for 3 weeks, and people had to share everything they had to get through. "That's the thing about hard country," Eleanor said, cradling her cup. "It shows you who people actually are. You can't keep up an act when you're trying to survive." "No," Evelyn agreed. "You can't." Eleanor looked at her over the rim of her cup. "You know Evelyn and I mean this in the most respectful way. I don't think James Whitfield deserting you was the worst thing that ever happened to you." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "I think it was the thing that forced you to find out what you're actually made of," Eleanor said. "Some people go their whole lives never knowing. You know now. And that's worth something." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Is it worth a wedding dress ruined in the dirt?" she said. "Considerably more," Eleanor said. They smiled at each other, cautiously, the way women do when they're deciding to trust each other and haven't quite committed to it yet, but are moving in that direction. Nathan came in from the barn at 11 and found them at his kitchen table. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them with the particular expression of a man encountering something he wasn't prepared for. "Eleanor," he said. "Nathan," Eleanor said, with her Queen of the County composure fully restored. "Sit down. We're having coffee." He looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him with an expression that said very clearly, "Don't ask questions, just sit down." He sat down. Evelyn poured him coffee, and Eleanor Briggs proceeded to tell him 3 stories about his own mother that he had never heard before, while Evelyn listened and laughed in the right places, and Nathan Cole sat at his own kitchen table with a look on his face that she could only describe as something starting to thaw. That night, after Eleanor left and the kitchen was cleaned and the lamps were turned down, Nathan came to the door of the hall where she was heading to her room. "How did that happen?" he said. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. "I asked her for coffee," Evelyn said. "She said yes." He shook his head slightly. "Eleanor Briggs doesn't say yes to things she doesn't want." "I know," Evelyn said. "She wanted to." He looked at her in the hallway lamplight. "You do that," he said. "You see what people want before they know they want it, and then you make a space for it." She looked back at him. The distance between them in the narrow hall was not very much. "I see it with you too," she said quietly. "Sometimes." Something moved in his face. Something underneath the surface too quick and too controlled for her to catch cleanly. "Evelyn," he said. And then he stopped. She waited. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I need you to know that I'm saying it plainly and without any pressure, as a statement of fact, not as an expectation." "All right," she said. "This house hasn't been a home in 4 years," he said, "and somewhere in the last few months, it has become one again." He held her gaze. "I'm aware that is your doing. I'm aware that it changes things. I don't—" He stopped again. "I don't know yet what I'm willing to do with that awareness. But I wanted you to know I have it." The hall was very quiet. "Thank you," she said, for saying it plainly. "It's the only way I know how to say things," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that about you." They stood in the hall for a moment that was full of everything neither of them was ready to say yet. Then he said, "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night, Nathan." She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at the far wall. She thought about 43 cents and a dirt road. She thought about a man who hadn't kept writing. She thought about doors that had been nailed shut and women patient enough to find the loose nail. Outside the window, the first real snow of winter was beginning to fall over the mountain pines. Quiet and certain, the way the most important changes always come, not announced, not dramatic, but simply arriving and settling and beginning to cover everything that came before. She listened to it. And for the first time since the morning she had read that letter in the church, she let herself want something. Not a house, not a future with a shape she could describe. Just this. Just this particular man in this particular hallway saying things plainly. Just the possibility that something lost could become something found. The snow fell. The ranch was quiet. And Evelyn Carter, who had arrived with nothing and built something out of that. Nothing, day by day, and board by board and row by row, closed her eyes and allowed herself for the first time to hope. And Evelyn Carter, who had arrived with nothing and built something out of that nothing, day by day, and board by board and row by row, closed her eyes and allowed herself for the first time to hope. But hope, she was about to learn, has a way of making you visible to the very people who most want to see you fail. The snow that fell that night was still on the ground 3 days later when the first letter arrived. It came with the regular post tucked between a seed catalog and a notice from the county land office. Nathan set it on the kitchen table without comment when he came in from the barn, and Evelyn might not have paid it any particular attention except that it had no return address, and the handwriting on the front was the precise, controlled script of someone who had chosen their penmanship carefully, the way people do when they want to appear composed while doing something they know is wrong. The letter was addressed to Nathan. She left it for him. He opened it at dinner, read it once, and set it face down on the table. She waited. He picked up his fork. "Nathan," she said. He set the fork back down. He turned the letter over and slid it across the table to her. She read it. It was not signed. It never is with letters like this. But the content was plain enough, a warning dressed up in the language of neighborly concern, suggesting that Nathan Cole had allowed a woman of questionable reputation to establish herself in his household, that the nature of their arrangement was the subject of widespread speculation in Raven Creek and the surrounding territory, and that a man in his position with a ranch to protect and a reputation to consider ought to think carefully about what he was inviting by continuing to harbor a woman who had been publicly rejected and was known to be without family, without prospects, and without the moral guidance that a proper home provided. Evelyn read it twice. She set it down. She picked up her own fork and took a deliberate bite of her dinner and chewed it slowly. "Do you know who sent it?" she said. "I have a strong suspicion," Nathan said. "Cathcart," she said. "Or someone he paid to write it," Nathan said. "Roy Cathcart's handwriting looks like a fence post fell on the paper. This is too neat." "He has a son-in-law who clerks at the land office," Evelyn said. "I've seen the man's correspondence." Nathan looked at her. "You've been paying attention to Roy Cathcart's family connections," he said. "I've been paying attention to anyone who might want to challenge this property's legal standing," she said. "Which now apparently includes anyone who wants to challenge my standing in it." She set her fork down and looked at him directly. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "I always answer honestly," he said. "It's one of my limited virtues." "Does this letter change anything for you?" she said. "About the arrangement here. About whether having me on this ranch is worth the complication." He held her gaze without blinking. "No," he said. "You didn't think about it," she said. "I thought about it before you finished the question," he said. "The answer is no." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She picked up her fork. He picked up his. "We should burn the letter," she said. "Already decided that," he said. After dinner he put it in the stove himself, and she watched the paper curl and blacken, and that was the end of that particular battle, or so she thought. The second letter came 4 days later. This one was addressed to her. Same handwriting. No return address. And this one was not dressed in neighborly concern at all. This one was direct and cold and specific, and the specific thing it said was that a woman in her position, abandoned landless living off a man's charity, had no business pretending to dignity she hadn't earned, and that Raven Creek had a long memory, and that the story of what she was doing in Nathan Cole's house would follow her to whatever next place she tried to make a life in. She read it in the kitchen alone. Nathan out in the barn, the morning light coming gray through the window. She read it and felt the old cold move through her. The specific cold of being told by someone anonymously, and with careful cruelty, exactly what they thought you were worth. She sat with it for 2 full minutes. Then she got up, walked to the stove, opened the door, and fed the letter to the fire herself. She didn't tell Nathan about it. She went back to work. But the letter had done what letters like that are designed to do, planted a seed in soil that was already more vulnerable than she'd admitted. She found herself noticing things she'd been managing to ignore. The way the clerk at the dry goods store had gone quiet when she walked in last week, and the 2 women at the counter had kept their voices low. The way Reverend Holt had looked at her on Sunday, with something in his face that might have been compassion, or might have been pity, and how those 2 things could feel so similar and be so different. She was still living in the space between acceptable and unacceptable, and the letter reminded her that the space was narrower than she'd allowed herself to believe. She was setting fence posts on the South Line 3 days later, working alone. Nathan having ridden to the neighboring Halverson Ranch to discuss a shared water rights issue when she heard hoofbeats on the Ridge Road. She didn't look up right away. She was in the middle of driving a post, and she finished the task before she turned. It was James Whitfield. Again. This time he wasn't alone. He had a man with him, older, well-dressed, with the kind of coat that didn't belong in working country, and a face Evelyn didn't recognize. She stood with the post driver in her hands and waited. James pulled up at the fence line. He looked at her, at the post driver, at the work gloves, at the state of her after a morning of hard physical labor, and something moved through his face that she read as discomfort. Good, she thought. Evelyn, he said. James, she said. You're making a habit of this. I need to speak with you, he said. It's important. You said that last time, she said. It wasn't. The older man with him cleared his throat slightly. James glanced at him, and then back at her. This is my uncle, James said. Gerald Whitfield. He's come from Denver. Evelyn looked at Gerald Whitfield. He was assessing her with the frank, unhurried appraisal of a man who makes financial decisions and has learned to read people the way an accountant reads a ledger, looking for discrepancies, looking for hidden liabilities. Mr. Whitfield, she said. Miss Carter, Gerald Whitfield said. His voice was educated and dry. I'll be direct. I've come to offer you a settlement. She stared at him. A settlement, she said. My nephew's choices caused you material harm, Gerald said. A woman in your position left without prospects, publicly humiliated, deserves some compensation for that harm. We're prepared to offer you $200 in exchange for your agreement not to pursue any legal remedy and to conduct yourself with discretion regarding my nephew's name. The silence stretched. A crow called somewhere above the ridge. Evelyn looked at Gerald Whitfield for a very long moment. Then she looked at James, who was staring at a point somewhere above her left shoulder. Legal remedy, she said slowly. Our lawyer advises that in some territories, Gerald began. Your lawyer advised you that a woman who was publicly abandoned at the altar might have grounds for breach of promise, Evelyn said. And rather than find out, you drove out here to pay me to stay quiet. Gerald Whitfield did not flinch. $200 is a considerable sum for a woman in my position, she said. Yes, you've used that phrase twice. I'd like you to stop. He stopped. She set the post driver down carefully against the fence line. She pulled off her work gloves finger by finger and held them in one hand. Mr. Whitfield, she said, I have not consulted a lawyer and I have no intention of pursuing legal remedy against your nephew, not because I couldn't, and not because $200 wouldn't be useful, but because I am not interested in spending one more hour of my life thinking about James Whitfield's choices when I have work to do and a life to build. She looked at James directly. But I want you to understand something, she said. The reason you're out here with your uncle and his checkbook is not because you're afraid of a lawsuit. It's because you're still trying to control the story. You want the clean version, the version where you made a practical choice and the woman you left understood and moved on quietly, and nothing complicated your next attempt at a respectable marriage. James's jaw was tight. There is no version of this story, she said quietly, where you get to decide how I conduct myself. Not for $200. Not for $2,000. She picked up her post driver. You should go home, James. Both of you. Gerald Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. You're a very stubborn woman, he said. I am, she agreed. Goodbye, Mr. Whitfield. She turned back to the fence line and drove the next post. She heard them sit there for a moment. Then she heard hoofbeats moving away. She drove 3 more posts before her hands started shaking. She stopped, pressed her palms flat against the post she was holding, breathed. $200. In another life, in the life of the woman sitting in the dirt beside the road in a wedding dress with 43 cents, $200 would have been an impossible fortune. It would have been a year of rent, a fresh start, in a new town breathing room. Everything she'd needed. She had just turned it down. She thought about why and found that the answer was simpler than she expected, because taking the money meant agreeing to be exactly what they believed she was. A problem to be managed. A complication to be settled. A woman whose dignity had a price tag and who could be bought into silence. She was not that. She had stopped being that sometime between the garden and the fence line and the evening. Nathan Cole said this house hasn't been a home in 4 years in a quiet hallway. She picked up the post driver. She finished the fence line. Nathan was back at the ranch before she returned from the south field, and he knew something had happened the moment she walked through the door. He had the particular alertness of a man who reads people the way he reads weather, by pressure changes, by the quality of stillness, by small signs that something is moving that hasn't shown itself yet. He waited until she had washed her hands and poured herself water before he said anything. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. James and Gerald Whitfield and the $200, and exactly what she'd said, and exactly what they'd said back. He listened without moving. When she finished, he said, "You turned down $200. "Yes," she said. "Why?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. The way he asked things, wanting the true answer, not a comfortable one. She looked at him across the kitchen. "Because it was money to make me disappear quietly," she said. "And I'm done disappearing." Something moved in his face, swift and fierce, and then controlled again. "All right," he said. "That's all," she said. "All right." "What else would I say?" he said. "It was your choice to make." "Most men," she said carefully, "would have an opinion about a woman turning down $200. I'm not most men," he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, not arrogance, something simpler and more solid than arrogance. A statement of plain fact from a man who had long since stopped performing and had simply decided to be what he was. "And you're not most women. We've established both of these things. $200 doesn't change them." Evelyn put her water glass down. She felt something in her chest that was getting harder and harder to keep at a manageable distance. "Nathan," she said. "Don't," he said gently. She stopped. He looked at her with those gray eyes, steady and careful, and full of something he wasn't ready to name out loud yet, and she understood without him saying another word that he felt exactly what she felt, and that he was as afraid of it as she was, and that they were both standing on the same edge looking at the same drop. "Not yet," he said. "But," he paused, "not never." She held his gaze. "All right," she said, and managed somehow to mean it. The twist that changed everything came on a Tuesday in early December, and it came from a direction neither of them expected. Eleanor Briggs arrived at the ranch just after noon without her usual commanding energy, without the hat she always wore like a flag of office. She came in a borrowed wagon, and she was moving faster than Evelyn had ever seen her move. And before she was through the door, she said, "Nathan, I need to speak to you both, and I need you to listen before you react." They sat at the kitchen table. Eleanor folded her hands on the table surface and looked at Nathan directly. "Roy Cathcart filed a complaint with the county this morning," she said. "He's contesting the land survey, but that's not the main issue." Nathan's jaw set. "The main issue," Eleanor continued, "is that he also filed a separate document with the county clerk. A formal complaint about the moral conduct of the inhabitants of this ranch." She paused. "He's named Evelyn specifically, and he's collected signatures." The silence in the kitchen was complete. "Signatures," Nathan said. His voice was flat in a way Evelyn had never heard before. Flat and very, very cold. "7 names," Eleanor said, "including Dorothy Marsh. Including the new pastor at the Methodist Church who arrived in October and doesn't know anyone, and apparently has been told a great deal by people who have an interest in how he forms his opinions." Evelyn sat very still. "What does the complaint allege?" she said. Eleanor looked at her steadily. "That you are living in a state of moral irregularity. That your presence on this ranch is a corrupting influence on the community. And that the county has a responsibility to—" Eleanor stopped. Her composure cracked just slightly at the edge. "To remove you." The word landed like a stone in still water. "Remove." "They can't do that," Nathan said. "They can make it extremely difficult for her to remain," Eleanor said. "In 1886 in this territory, A complaint of this nature with 7 signatures goes to the county sheriff and to the district morality board. And while the legal standing is questionable, the social standing. I understand the social standing, Evelyn said. Both of them looked at her. She was very quiet. Her hands were on the table flat and still, and her face was composed in the way it gets when she is thinking faster than she's speaking. How long do we have before this becomes public? She said. It may already be, Eleanor said. The clerk is a friend of Cathcart's son-in-law. Of course he was, Evelyn thought. What does your lawyer say? Nathan asked Eleanor. I haven't spoken to my lawyer yet, Eleanor said. I came here first. She looked at Evelyn. Because you needed to know before you heard it in the street. Evelyn sat with the weight of it. She had known this was possible. She had known from the first day that she was living on the edge of what this community would tolerate, and that the edge was moving, and that eventually she might get pushed off it. She had known, and she had worked anyway, and she had built anyway, and she had hoped anyway. And now, here it was. Remove. She looked up. I need to speak with Nathan alone, she said to Eleanor. Eleanor Briggs, to her considerable credit, stood up immediately, said she'd wait on the porch, and left without argument. The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan was still sitting at the table. He was looking at his hands, the scarred, calloused hands of a man who had worked this land alone for 4 years, and his jaw was tight with something she recognized as controlled fury. Say what you're thinking, she said. You know what I'm thinking, he said. Say it out loud, she said. He looked up. I'm thinking that Roy Cathcart filed a fraudulent land complaint and lost, and now he's found a weapon that costs him nothing to use and could cost you everything. I'm thinking that 7 people in this town signed their names to a lie and called it a moral concern. And I'm thinking... He stopped. Say it, she said. I'm thinking that the simplest solution to all of this is one that I've been telling myself I wasn't ready for, he said. And I need to know if it's a solution you'd even want, or if the timing makes it... He stopped again, pressed his hands flat on the table. I don't want to offer you something because you're backed into a corner. That's not what I want. Evelyn looked at him. Her heart was beating at a pace she was doing her best to ignore. What do you want? She said. He raised his eyes to hers. I want you to stay, he said. Not because Cathcart is threatening, not because Eleanor thinks it would solve the problem, but because 4 months ago I didn't know how to be in this house, and now I do, and the difference is, you and I am... He searched for the word with the focused effort of a man who has not said true things out loud in a very long time. I am not willing to go back to what this was before you got here. The kitchen was absolutely silent. That's not a proposal, he said carefully. I'm not asking you to do anything because of Cathcart or the complaint or the 7 names. I'm just telling you the truth about what I want. Because you asked. Evelyn looked at this man, this stubborn, careful, quietly brave man who hadn't kept riding. The truth about what I want, she said slowly, is the same as what you just said, but I need to know that you understand what you'd be taking on. Not the ranch. I know you know the ranch. I mean me. She held his gaze. I have opinions. I've been known to send powerful men off my property with legal references. I turned down $200 this afternoon without asking you first. I will continue to do all of those things. I know, he said. And I'm not Margaret, she said quietly. I will never be Margaret. His face moved through something difficult and real and present. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking you to be, she breathed. Then ask me something, she said. Ask me something real. He looked at her for a long moment. Will you stay, he said. Not as my hired hand, as will you stay as mine. It was imperfect. It was incomplete. It was not the speech from a novel or the careful declaration of a practiced man. It was Nathan Cole asking a true question in the only language he had, which was plain and direct and entirely without ornament. Yes, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. And then Eleanor Briggs knocked on the kitchen door and called through it. I don't want to intrude, but it is quite cold out here, and I can see through the window that you're both still sitting at the table, so I'm going to come back in now. And she opened the door and came in and stopped when she saw their faces. She looked at Nathan, then at Evelyn. "Oh," she said. Then she sat down at the table, folded her hands again, and said, "All right, what's the plan?" The plan, as it turned out, required 3 things. First, Nathan rode to town the next morning and retained the services of Arthur Hollis. The only lawyer in Raven Creek, who was 62 years old, had been practicing for 30 years and had a particular and well-documented distaste for Roy Cathcart that stemmed from a property dispute in 1879 that had been decided in Arthur Hollis's client's favor by a margin of 6 inches. Arthur Hollis listened to the situation for 20 minutes and then said, "The land complaint is dead. I buried it once, and I'll bury it again." The morality complaint is more complicated, but considerably more fragile. 7 signatures means 7 people who will need to stand up in front of the county and say they have personal knowledge of misconduct. They don't. They have gossip. He looked at Nathan over his spectacles. "Is there anything the county might actually find if they looked?" "No," Nathan said. "Then they'll find nothing," Arthur said, which means this is a harassment campaign, and harassment campaigns have a way of collapsing when the person being harassed refuses to collapse with them. Second, Eleanor Briggs, who had been the arbiter of Raven Creek's social standards for 20 years, and who had both a long memory and a deep investment in protecting Nathan Cole's interests, made 3 visits in the following week. She visited Dorothy Marsh first, and whatever was said in that conversation caused Dorothy Marsh to quietly withdraw her signature from the complaint by the end of the day. She visited the Methodist minister second, and while the nature of that conversation was also private, the minister subsequently sent a written note to the county clerk expressing that he had formed his opinion based on incomplete information and was withdrawing his name, pending personal investigation. She visited the 3rd most prominent signatory third, a rancher named Perkins, whose land shared a water source with Nathan's, and after 40 minutes of Eleanor Briggs explaining with exquisite detail and perfect recall exactly which of his own past decisions had been questionable enough to become community conversation. If community conversation were the currency they were trading in, Perkins also withdrew. 4 signatures gone in 1 week. 3 remaining. Third, Evelyn Carter walked into Raven Creek on a Thursday morning and did her shopping, and settled her accounts, and greeted every person she encountered by name, calmly, pleasantly, and with the specific upright posture of a woman who has decided she is not interested in being diminished, and is no longer going to conduct herself as though she might be. It was not a grand gesture, it was not a speech. It was simply a woman going about her business as though her right to do so was not in question. And something about that, the absolute refusal to hide the complete absence of the shame they expected, did more to shift the mood of Raven Creek than any legal document or social call. Because shame only has power over people who accept it. Evelyn Carter had accepted it for the last time sitting in the dirt by the road in August. She wasn't interested in it anymore. She bought her salt and her flour and her thread, and she said good morning to the people who would meet her eye. And she said nothing to the people who wouldn't. And she walked back through the door of the dry goods store and past the women who lowered their voices when she entered, and she did it with a steadiness that people would talk about long after the morality complaint was dead and buried. On her way out of town, she passed James Whitfield on the main street. He was with a woman she didn't recognize, well-dressed young, from the look of her. Someone's daughter brought in from elsewhere, the kind of arrangement James Whitfield was apparently still trying to engineer. He saw Evelyn at the same moment she saw him. He stopped. She didn't. She kept walking at the same pace, chin level, eyes forward, and she passed him on the street of the town that had watched her fall, and was now watching her refuse to stay fallen, and she didn't look back. She heard him say her name quietly to the empty air behind her. She kept walking. That evening she told Nathan what had happened in town. He listened at the kitchen table, And when she finished, he looked at her with the steady gray eyes that she had learned to read, the way she read weather now, by pressure changes, by the quality of stillness. "Are you all right?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes. Not performing, yes. Actually." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. One word. The same word he had said months ago about James Whitfield. And she felt it the same way she'd felt it then, landing somewhere real and staying there. "Nathan," she said. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to think about it before you answer." He looked at her directly. "I'm listening." She folded her hands on the table. "If we do this," she said, "if we make this real and formal and permanent, it's not going to make the town's opinion change overnight. Some people will always think what they think. Roy Cathcart will find another angle eventually. James Whitfield will tell whatever version of this story makes him look least foolish at his next dinner party." She paused. "I'm not the kind of woman people stop talking about once they've started." "I know," he said. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it. Genuinely thought the way he did without rushing, without performing consideration he didn't feel. "No," he said. "You know what bothers me?" "What?" "The 4 years before you got here," he said quietly. "The silence. The way the house was just a building I slept in. The way I woke up in the morning and couldn't think of one thing I was looking forward to." He held her gaze. "That bothers me. You don't." Evelyn Carter sat at that kitchen table and felt something in her chest open like a door that had been closed too long, not dramatically, not with great noise, but with the quiet inevitability of something that has been wanting to open for a very long time, finally finding the right moment. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand palm up and held hers. They sat like that for a long time in the kitchen that had become a home again, in the house that had been a building, and was now a place where someone looked forward to morning. Outside, the snow was falling again over the mountains, quiet and certain. And in Raven Creek, 3 signatures on a morality complaint against Evelyn Carter were about to find themselves very, very alone. And in Raven Creek, 3 signatures on a morality complaint against Evelyn Carter were about to find themselves very, very alone, because the kind of woman who walks through a town that has tried to break her chin level and eyes forward is not the kind of woman that 3 frightened men and their borrowed courage can outlast. Arthur Hollis filed the response to the morality complaint on a Monday morning. Evelyn didn't go with Nathan to the county clerk's office. She had offered, and he had said it wasn't necessary, and she had understood that he needed to do this part himself, that there was something in the act of walking into that office and laying down the legal response that was about more than paperwork. It was Nathan Cole, who had spent 4 years contracting himself into a smaller and smaller life, deciding out loud that he was done with that. She stayed at the ranch and worked. She was repairing the hinges on the barn door, a job that had been on the list since October, and kept getting displaced by more urgent things when she heard his horse on the road at mid-afternoon. She didn't stop working. She listened to the quality of the hoofbeats, the pace, and knew before he came through the gate that whatever had happened in town had gone well enough. He came into the barn and stood for a moment watching her work. "Well," she said without looking up. "Hollis filed the response," Nathan said. "Cathcart's remaining 3 signatures will need to present personal testimony of witnessed misconduct at a formal county hearing. Personal testimony, under oath." He paused. "Hollis gives it 2 weeks before all 3 withdraw." She tightened the last hinge bolt and set down the wrench. "And the land survey, dead," he said. Hollis used the word frivolous in his filing, which in legal language is approximately the equivalent of calling Cathcart a liar to his face in front of the entire county. She picked up her tools and looked at him. His expression was doing the thing it did when he was satisfied about something, but wasn't going to perform satisfaction, the particular stillness of a man whose inner temperature has risen, and who considers showing it a kind of vanity. "Good," she said. "Hollis also said something else," Nathan said. His tone had changed slightly. She heard it immediately. She waited. He said that the most efficient and permanent resolution to any future challenges of this nature would be to remove the legal ambiguity of your status here. Nathan held her gaze steadily. His word, ambiguity. I know what word he used, she said. What did you say? I told him I was aware of that. Nathan said, and that it was being handled. The barn was very quiet. Being handled, she said. Yes. That's what you told your lawyer. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Nathan Cole, she said, if you are telling me that your lawyer's legal filing is the reason you're about to say what I think you're about to say, I need you to stop right now and think about whether that's what's actually happening. He didn't blink. It's not, he said. My lawyer's legal filing is the reason I'm saying it today, instead of waiting another 3 weeks while I argued with myself about timing. The reason I'm saying it at all has nothing to do with Arthur Hollis. She put down her toolbox. Then say it, she said. Say it plainly. Marry me, he said. 2 words, no ornamentation, no bent knee, no speech prepared in advance, no romantic staging. Just Nathan Cole in a barn doorway saying the truest thing he knew how to say in the only way he knew how to say it. She looked at him. Ask me like you mean it, she said. Not cruelly, testing. Something shifted in his face, something that moved past the controlled surface, into the real country. Underneath it, the place where Nathan Cole actually lived when he wasn't managing himself. I mean it, he said, and his voice was different now. Lower, less careful. I have meant it for longer than I've been willing to admit, which is something I'm not proud of, because you've been here working yourself to the bone and deserving better than a man who waits for a lawyer to prompt him into honesty. He took a step toward her. I'm asking you because this house is alive again, and you did that. I'm asking you because you sent Roy Cathcart off this property with a legal reference, and I have never in my life been so... He stopped. I'm asking you because I wake up in the morning looking forward to things, and that hasn't happened in 4 years, and it is entirely your fault. Evelyn Carter stood in the barn with her toolbox at her feet and looked at this man. She thought about August, about the dirt road and the ivory dress and the 43 cents. About the way she had sat beside that road and asked herself where someone goes when they have nowhere left. She thought about all the things she had built since then, the garden and the fence line and the jars of preserved vegetables and the repaired hinges and the relationships she'd made and the fights she'd won and the money she'd turned down and the way she'd walked through Raven Creek on a Thursday morning, refusing to be ashamed. She thought about all of that and she said yes. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands, the scarred, calloused hands that had spent 4 years managing alone and were now holding something they hadn't expected to hold again, and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the careful, managed gesture of a man who was still holding himself back. It was a man who had made up his mind. She kissed him back with the same certainty. When they separated, she was breathing differently, and his hands were still on her face, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your lawyer is going to be very pleased with himself." And Nathan Cole laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. Really laugh. Not the brief, controlled, almost smile she'd learned to watch for, but an actual laugh unguarded and surprised out of him, and it was one of the best sounds she had ever heard in her life. "He is," Nathan agreed. Insufferably. They got married on a Thursday. Not a Sunday, not a Saturday, not a day chosen for its social significance or its convenience to other people's schedules. A Thursday because that was the day Arthur Hollis confirmed that the last 3 signatures had been withdrawn from the morality complaint, and because Evelyn had decided privately that she wanted to get married on a day that meant something to the 2 of them and nobody else. Reverend Holt performed the ceremony. He had come to the ranch 2 days before to speak with Evelyn privately, and he had said without preamble, "I owe you an apology. I watched you walk out of my church in August, and I did not follow you, and I have thought about that every week since." Evelyn had looked at the old reverend with his white hair and round shoulders and the particular exhaustion of a man who has comforted 1,000 people through hard moments and has finally had to reckon with a moment when he hadn't. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." He had nodded. "Will you let me perform the ceremony? It would mean something to me. To finish what I should have started differently." She had said yes. The ceremony was small. Eleanor Briggs came. Arthur Hollis came and did look insufferably pleased with himself, which Evelyn found she didn't mind at all. The Halverson family from the neighboring ranch came, husband and wife people who had watched Nathan Cole manage alone for 4 years and had the decency to simply be glad. And the young messenger boy, Thomas, she had learned his name was Thomas, and he was 13, and he had been carrying the weight of that August letter ever since, came with his mother. And Evelyn had specifically asked for him to be there because she wanted him to see how a story that starts with a terrible errand can end somewhere entirely different. Thomas stood in the back of the room with his hat in both hands, exactly as she remembered him from the church, and when she caught his eye during the ceremony, he went pink with something that was equal parts embarrassment and relief. She smiled at him. He managed a small smile back. It was enough. Nathan held her hands and said the words Reverend Holt gave him. And then he said the words he had chosen himself, which were not long, but were entirely true. "I didn't know what I was offering when I stopped on that road. I know now. And I would stop again. Every time." She said her own words back to him. "You gave me a place to stand when I had none. I'm going to spend the rest of my life building something worthy of that." Reverend Holt said what he needed to say. Nathan kissed her. Eleanor Briggs produced from somewhere in her formidable coat a small bottle of good whiskey, which she said was non-negotiable and had been Nathan's mother's preference at celebrations. And Arthur Hollis produced a cake from the bakery in Raven Creek that was arguably too large for 7 people. And Thomas ate 3 pieces, and the Halversons told stories about the early days of the valley that had everyone laughing, and Evelyn sat beside Nathan at the table in the house that had been a building and was now definitively and permanently a home. At some point in the evening, Eleanor Briggs leaned close to Evelyn and said quietly, "She would have loved this. Margaret. She was always better at celebrating than Nathan ever was." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm going to work on that." Eleanor Briggs squeezed her hand once. It was the first time the older woman had touched her. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I imagine you will." The news traveled through Raven Creek the way news always traveled, fast, thorough, and carrying more opinion than fact. By Friday morning, the entire town knew that Nathan Cole had married Evelyn Carter, the woman who had been left at the altar 4 months before, and the response was, as these things go, divided. The people who had signed their names to the morality complaint and then withdrawn those names found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to explain their position shift, which they did with varying degrees of grace. Cathcart said nothing publicly, which was the loudest thing he could have done, and the silence read to everyone in Raven Creek exactly as it was intended to, as a man who had lost and knew it and wasn't interested in drawing more attention to the loss. Dorothy Marsh told 3 separate people in one day that she had always thought Evelyn Carter was a remarkable woman and that she was delighted by the marriage, a claim that was so thoroughly revisionist that it circled back around to being almost admirable in its audacity. Reverend Holt mentioned the marriage favorably in Sunday's sermon, not by name, but with a clarity that left no one in the pews uncertain about the reference. He spoke about judgment and time and the particular foolishness of a community that decides what a person is worth before that person has had the chance to show them. Several people in that church felt the words land somewhere specific and personal. Some of them deserved to. But none of that was what Evelyn was thinking about on the first real morning of her married life. What she was thinking about was something much smaller and more real. She was thinking about the way Nathan handed her the coffee cup. She had been in his kitchen for 4 months. He had handed her coffee every morning. But this morning, when he turned from the stove and put the cup in her hands, the gesture was different in no way she could describe and completely different in every way she could feel. As though the same motion performed by the same hands carried an entirely new weight, because both of them knew something they hadn't known yesterday. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at him over the rim. "You're staring?" he said back to the stove. "I'm observing," she said. "There's a difference." He turned. The gray eyes, the jaw, the particular stillness of Nathan Cole, which she now understood was not coldness, but the opposite of coldness. A man who felt things so specifically and so deeply that he had learned to hold very still under the force of it, because if he moved, he might give himself away entirely. "What are you observing?" he said. "A man who smiles more than he used to," she said. He looked at her. "Don't make a thing of it," he said. "I'm absolutely going to make a thing of it," she said. He shook his head, but the corner of his mouth moved. She took her coffee and went to the window. Outside, the winter morning was doing what winter mornings in this territory do: stark blue, cold the mountains white to the tree line. But the ranch was moving alive with the sounds of horses and the distant call of one of the Halverson hands Nathan had hired for the season, helping manage the cattle. The barn door was open, the hinges she had repaired holding exactly as they should. The vegetable garden was under its frost cloth, but she knew what was sleeping underneath it: the garlic she'd put in before the freeze, which would be the first thing to push through in the spring. She thought, "I planted that. I'll be here when it comes up." The enormity of that simple fact that she would be here in the spring, that this was her ground to tend, that she had a claim on this place that no letter and no complaint and no withdrawn signature could touch, moved through her so cleanly and completely that it took her a moment to steady herself against it. "Evelyn," Nathan said. She turned. He was watching her from the stove with the careful attention of a man who has learned to read what she's feeling by the set of her shoulders. "I'm all right," she said. "Better than all right." He nodded once, turned back to the stove. She watched his back for a moment, the width of his shoulders. The deliberate, economical way he moved, never wasted motion, everything purposeful. She thought, "I get to know this person. I get to keep knowing him." That was the thing she hadn't expected, not just the having of something, but the ongoing discovery of it. The way Nathan Cole unfolded slowly and in his own time, like something planted deep that reveals itself gradually. She had not expected to fall in love in a barn and a kitchen and a garden over 4 months of honest work. But there it was. The trouble when it arrived was wearing a familiar face. It came in the second week of January, and it announced itself at the ranch gate with a hired horse and a well-pressed coat and an expression that managed to be simultaneously sheepish and calculating, which was, Evelyn thought, a genuinely impressive combination. James Whitfield. She was alone at the house. Nathan had ridden to town for the bank. She saw the horse from the kitchen window and felt the old cold move through her. Not fear, not longing, but the specific weariness of someone who has dealt with the same problem more times than is reasonable and is running low on patience for it. She went to the porch. She did not invite him through the gate. He stood on the other side of it and looked at her. His hat was in his hands again. He had the appearance of a man who has been rehearsing something and is now discovering that the performance is significantly harder than the rehearsal. "I heard you got married," he said. "I did," she said. "To Cole?" "Yes." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. I needed to say something to you. In person. Without my uncle. Without—" He stopped. "Just me." She studied him across the gate. Whatever he had come to say, she believed him that he'd come alone to say it. That was something at least. "Say it," she said. He took a breath. "I was a coward," he said. "What I did in August was a coward's act dressed up as practicality, and I told myself it was a business decision, because calling it what it actually was, fear would have required me to reckon with myself in a way I wasn't prepared to do." He paused. "I've done a fair amount of reckoning since then. Helena Marsh's family did reject me as you predicted, and I spent about a month feeling sorry for myself, and then about another month being honest with myself, which was considerably less comfortable." Evelyn listened. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I know you're married. I know I don't have any standing here, and I'm not pretending otherwise." He looked at her steadily. I just wanted to tell you to your face without any lawyers or uncles or settlements. I'm sorry. What I did to you was wrong. Not just inconvenient or poorly timed. Wrong. And you deserved better." The silence stretched between them across the gate. Evelyn looked at James Whitfield. This man, she had almost built a life with this man who had written her out of his future in a letter with neat, careful handwriting and sent it with a 12-year-old boy, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not anger. Not bitterness. Something simpler. Something almost like release. "I know you're sorry," she said. He exhaled. "But I want to tell you something," she said. "Not to wound you, to tell you the truth." He waited. "If you had shown up on that Thursday," she said, "I would have married you. I would have been grateful for the house and the future and the belonging that I thought you represented. And I would have spent years slowly discovering that what I called love was actually just need dressed up in better clothes." She held his gaze. "What you did was a coward's act. But it gave me the chance to find out what I was actually capable of when I had nothing and nowhere to go. And that is worth more than anything I thought I was going to have with you." James Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face broke open, not dramatically, but genuinely the way things break when the truth finally gets through the surface. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a real question, not performance. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "More than I knew how to be in August." He nodded. He put his hat back on. "Good," he said. "I'm glad of it." He turned his horse. She watched him ride back down the ridge road, and then she went back inside and made herself a second cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window and felt the past settle into its proper place behind her, real and finished, and unable to reach her anymore. Nathan came back from town at mid-afternoon. He came into the kitchen, put his coat on the hook, and looked at her with the pressure-reading attention she'd grown to depend on. "Someone came," he said. Not a question. "James Whitfield," she said. She watched the muscle in his jaw. "He apologized," she said. "A real one. No lawyers, no checkbooks, just him." She picked up her cup. "I told him I was happy. He said he was glad. He left." Nathan looked at her steadily. "Are you all right?" he said. "I just told you," she said. "I'm happy." "That's not what I asked," he said. She smiled at him, the specific smile she had developed for moments when Nathan Cole saw through her to the thing she hadn't said yet. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right. He's gone, and I mean that in every sense. He's just gone, out of the part of me that was holding on to it." She set her cup down. "I feel lighter." Nathan held her gaze. Then he crossed the kitchen, and he did not stop until he had his arms around her, and she pressed her forehead into his shoulder, and he held on with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided what he's holding and has no intention of letting go. They stood like that for a while. Then she said into his shoulder, "Eleanor is coming for dinner on Saturday." "I know," he said. "She's bringing her niece from Denver." "I know that too," he said. "She told me yesterday." Evelyn pulled back enough to look at him. "She told you?" "She tells me things," he said. "Eleanor has been telling me things I didn't ask to know for 30 years. It's one of the fixed conditions of being her friend." "And yet you're still her friend," Evelyn said. "She was Margaret's family," he said simply. "And now she's yours. So," he shrugged slightly. "The niece is apparently 22 years old and recently jilted, and Eleanor has decided that exposing her to your particular example is therapeutic." Evelyn stared at him. "Eleanor is using me as a cautionary no as an example." "An inspirational example," Nathan said. Those were her words. "Nathan." "Your friend is extraordinary." "She is." He agreed. "Terrifying, but extraordinary." Evelyn shook her head, and the laugh that came out of her was real and unguarded, the kind that belongs only to people who feel safe enough to be surprised by their own joy. The Saturday dinner was in the way of all Eleanor Briggs's social engineering more effective than it had any right to be. The niece was named Clara, and she was 22, and she had the particular look of a young woman who has recently had something humiliating happen to her in public and has not yet decided what to do about it. A look Evelyn recognized with an intimacy that required no introduction. Clara sat at the dinner table and was quiet while the adults talked, and somewhere in the middle of the meal, she looked at Evelyn and said abruptly, and clearly surprising herself, "Is it true you were left at the altar?" The table went slightly still. Nathan picked up his fork. Eleanor kept her expression perfectly composed. Evelyn looked at Clara directly. "Yes," she said. "In front of 60 people." Clara absorbed this. "And you just, what did you do?" "I walked out," Evelyn said, "and sat in the dirt for a few hours, and then I went to work." Clara looked at the table, then at Evelyn. "I was left by letter," she said very quietly. "He didn't even come in person." "James Whitfield sent a letter through a 12-year-old boy," Evelyn said, "into a church full of people." Clara looked up. "Then we've both been dealt the same specific kind of cowardice," Evelyn said. "The question is just what you do with it." "What did you do?" Clara said. Evelyn looked at Nathan, then back at Clara. "I found out what I was made of," she said. "Turned out it was more than I knew." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up her fork. And that was the thing about Evelyn Carter, about Evelyn Cole, that people in Raven Creek would eventually come to understand. She didn't give speeches. She didn't make proclamations. She simply lived the truth of what she'd learned so openly and so consistently that it became impossible to be near her without being affected by it. She had arrived with nothing, and she had built something. And the something she had built was not just a garden and a fixed fence line and filled jars and repaired hinges. It was proof of something that people who had lost everything needed to see, that the bottom was not the end. That was what Eleanor Briggs had understood, and what Clara was beginning to understand, and what Raven Creek was slowly, reluctantly, and then finally with something approaching genuine respect coming to understand. February came, and the cold deepened, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of the hardest part of winter. Nathan and Evelyn fell into the patterns of people who have decided to share a life, and are learning day by day what that actually means, not the idea of it, but the real texture of it, the way two people's habits and preferences and tolerances have to find each other and negotiate and sometimes give way. She was a morning person. He was a man of 2 volumes, productive silence and necessary speech. She organized things. He maintained things. She expanded. He consolidated. She pushed open. He held steady. The way the ranch needed both things, the expanding and the holding, was not lost on either of them. One evening in late February, Nathan came into the kitchen, where she was working on the accounts. She had taken over the ranch accounts completely by now, and the books were in better order than they had been since before Margaret died, a fact that Arthur Hollis had confirmed when he'd reviewed them in January. And he sat down across from her and said, "I have something to tell you." She looked up. "Roy Cathcart's son-in-law at the land office has been dismissed," he said. Apparently, the county assessor discovered that several recent survey filings had been adjusted before entering the official record. Cathcart's surveyor on our case was the same man who'd been doing the adjusting. Evelyn set down her pen. "Fraud," she said. "Fraud," Nathan confirmed. "Which means Cathcart not only failed to push our fence line back, he exposed his own method. The county assessor is now reviewing every filing that surveyor touched in the last 2 years." She absorbed this. 3 of those filings, Nathan said, involve properties whose owners have been quietly losing land for years. They had no idea it was happening. "And now," she said. "And now they'll get it back," he said. She looked at him. There was something in his face that she'd been watching grow for months. Something that had been contracted and careful when she first arrived and was now slowly and certainly opening. Like the ranch itself, like the garden, like things given the right conditions after too long in the cold. "You know what I keep thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you'd kept riding that day," she said. "In August, past the road where I was sitting." He looked at her steadily. "I keep thinking about the woman I would have stayed if no one had stopped," she said. "The woman who would have found some small, quiet corner to disappear into and told herself it was enough." "You wouldn't have stayed that way," he said. "You're not built for disappearing." "You don't know that," she said. "I do," he said. "I watched you face down Cathcart and Eleanor and Whitfield and his uncle and a county complaint and your own fear. You don't disappear. You dig in." He paused. "But I'm glad I stopped, for entirely selfish reasons." She smiled at him. "Entirely selfish," she said. "Entirely," he said. And the corner of his mouth moved. She reached across the account book and took his hand. He turned it palm up and held hers. Outside, the February wind was doing what February wind in the Colorado Territory does. Insistent cold testing every joint and seam of the house to find the places where it could get in. But the house was well built and well maintained, and the hinges she had repaired were holding, and the curtains she had made were keeping the draft back, and inside it was warm and lit and quiet, with the specific quiet of people who have found each other and are at rest in it. She thought about spring, about the garlic sleeping in the frozen garden, about the rose bush under its burlap frame, about what would be the first to push through when the temperature finally gave way. She thought about Clara, who had gone back to Denver with something in her posture that was slightly more upright than when she'd arrived. She thought about Thomas, the messenger boy, who had come to her the previous week with a grammar question for his schoolwork and stayed for an hour and left with 3 extra cookies and a sentence correction that she'd made him repeat back to her until he had it. She thought about the house that had been a building and was now a home. She thought about all of it, the full, complex, hard-won, improbable shape of the life she had built from a dirt road and 43 cents and a man who hadn't kept writing. "Nathan," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her. "For what specifically?" "For stopping," she said. "That day, on that road." He was quiet for a moment. "You would have found your way," he said. "Maybe," she said. "But not here. Not this." He held her gaze with the gray eyes that she could read now, like weather, like the mountains, like the particular way the morning light moved through the kitchen window. "No," he said quietly, "not this." And the fire burned in the stove, and the wind pushed at the walls and found them solid. And somewhere under the frozen garden, the garlic was waiting for spring with the patient certainty of things that know they are going to come through. And somewhere under the frozen garden, the garlic was waiting for spring with the patient certainty of things that know they are going to come through. And Evelyn Cole, who had learned to trust that same certainty in herself, was about to discover that the hardest test of everything she had built was not behind her at all. It was coming up the Ridge Road on a Tuesday morning in March, wearing a black coat and carrying news that would force her to choose one final time between the woman she used to be and the woman she had become. The letter came from Denver. Not an anonymous letter this time. Not Cathcart's hired handwriting or Gerald Whitfield's legal maneuvering. This letter arrived through the official post with a proper return address and a name on it that Evelyn didn't recognize, a law firm. Harding and Associates, Denver, Colorado Territory. It was addressed to her. Her name, her address. Evelyn Cole, Cole Ranch, Raven Creek. She read it at the kitchen table, while Nathan watched her from across the room, reading her face the way he always did, not interrupting. She read it once, twice. She set it down. "My father had a life insurance policy," she said. Nathan was still. "He bought it in 1879, she said. "Apparently he paid the premiums for 6 years without telling me. When the farm was sold to cover debts, the policy wasn't included in the debt settlement, because the lawyer handling the estate didn't know it existed." She paused. "Harding and Associates has been trying to locate me since December. They tracked me here through the county marriage record." "How much?" Nathan said quietly. She looked up at him. $800, she said. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. $800 in 1887 was not a fortune by the standards of the wealthy men who moved through Denver's financial circles, but by the standards of a woman who had sat beside a road with 43 cents in her bodice. It was something so far beyond what she had allowed herself to imagine that it didn't feel real. It felt like a number in a story, like something that happened to other people. "Nathan," she said. "It's yours," he said immediately. "I know it's mine," she said. I'm not asking permission." She looked at the letter again. "I'm trying to figure out what it means." "What it means," he said carefully, "is that your father was a man who was planning for you even when he couldn't tell you he was planning. And that $800 belongs to you." She pressed her fingers flat against the letter. Here was the thing she was not saying out loud yet, the thing she was turning over in the privacy of her own chest. $800 was enough to buy land. Small land, but real land. A place with her name on the deed. A piece of ground that belonged to her alone, independent of marriage or arrangement, or any man's decision. It was everything she had needed in August, and she didn't need it any more in the same way, which raised a question she had to answer honestly. What did she need it for now? Nathan crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. He didn't touch her hands. He just sat there, present, waiting. "Say what you're thinking," he said. She looked at him. "In August," she said, "the thing I was most afraid of was having no ground of my own, no place where I had an independent claim, no floor." She paused. "I married you because I wanted to. I've been clear on that from the moment you asked, but I want you to understand something about what this money represents to me." "Tell me," he said. "It means I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "It means I'm here because I choose to be, every single day, not from necessity, from choice." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand the difference between those two things. I need to understand it myself." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I have always known you were here by choice, Evelyn. I knew it the day you turned down $200 from Whitfield's uncle. I knew it the day you walked through Raven Creek with your chin up and gave nobody the satisfaction of watching you fold." He leaned forward slightly. "I have never for one single day believed you stayed because you had to." She looked at him. "But," he said. She waited. "But I'm glad you have the floor now," he said. "In every sense. Not because it changes what you are to me, but because you deserve to have it. Your father tried to give it to you, and it got delayed, and now it's here." He paused. "What do you want to do with it?" She looked at the letter. "I want to invest it in this ranch," she said. "Not as a wife putting money into her husband's property, as a partner with a formal stake." She met his eyes. "I want my name on the deed, Nathan, beside yours. I want it to be official and legal and recorded with the county." He held her gaze. "That's what you want," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. And he said it without hesitation, without calculation, without a single beat of the pause that would have told her he was managing the request rather than answering it honestly. She breathed. "Arthur Hollis is going to have another very good month," she said. And Nathan Cole smiled the real smile, the one that had been coming more easily and more often since August, the one she took private credit for, and said, "He deserves it. He's earned us." They went to Arthur Hollis's office on a Friday. Arthur Hollis read the insurance letter, confirmed its legitimacy with the professional economy of a man who has been reading legal documents for 30 years, and then sat back in his chair and looked at them both over his spectacles with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and something close to wonder. "You want to add Mrs. Cole's name to the deed as co-owner," he said. "Correct," Nathan said. "With equal standing." "Correct," Evelyn said. Arthur Hollis looked at Evelyn. "And you'd like to invest the insurance proceeds into the ranch operating fund, documented as a capital contribution that establishes your co-ownership?" "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been practicing law in this territory for 30 years, Arthur Hollis said. "I have seen exactly 3 women walk into this office and ask to have their names on a property deed. He picked up his pen. "You'll be the fourth, and the circumstances will make this particular filing the most satisfying piece of paperwork I have ever had the pleasure of producing." Evelyn looked at him. "Because of Cathcart's failed complaint," she said. "Because of Cathcart's failed complaint," he confirmed. "The same county clerk's office that received that document will now receive this one, permanently recorded, adjacent entries in the same fiscal year." He almost smiled. "I find the symmetry professionally gratifying." Nathan caught Evelyn's eye across the office. She looked away before she laughed out loud, which required more control than she expected. The paperwork took 2 weeks to process through the county. During those 2 weeks, Evelyn went about the ranch with the same steadiness she had maintained since August: the morning coffee, the accounts, the livestock management, the ongoing work of keeping a living operation alive through the last hard weeks of winter. But something had shifted in the quality of her presence. She couldn't have named it precisely. It wasn't confidence, she'd had that for months. It wasn't happiness, she'd found that in small increments since the day she'd covered Margaret's rosebush in burlap, and Nathan had said she would have liked you. It was something closer to settledness. The specific piece of a person who has stopped bracing for the fall, because they finally genuinely trust the ground. She noticed it most in the mornings. In the way she came into the kitchen without the background calculation, she hadn't even known she was doing the constant low-level accounting of what she had and what she owed and what the cost of staying would be if things went wrong. That accounting had been running underneath everything since August, so constant she'd stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a clock ticking until it stops. Now it had stopped. The quiet was remarkable. Thomas came by on a Saturday with his grammar work and stayed for 2 hours and left with the cookies and the corrections and a book from Evelyn's small shelf that she pressed into his hands, because she'd noticed 3 weeks ago that he was reading faster than the school could supply him, and she'd been waiting for the right moment to do something about it. He stood at the door with the book and looked at her with the serious face of a 13-year-old boy who doesn't know how to receive things gracefully yet. "You sure?" he said. "It's a loan," she said. "You bring it back when you're done and tell me what you thought of it." He looked at the cover, looked at her. "What if I don't like it?" "Then you tell me that too," she said. "Honestly, I'd rather have your honest opinion than your polite one." He thought about this for a moment with the genuine seriousness he brought to everything. "My ma says I don't have a polite opinion," he said. "Your ma is right," Evelyn said. "That's why I'm asking you." He left with the book held carefully in both hands, like it was something he didn't want to damage, before he'd decided what to do with it. She watched him go, and felt the specific warmth of something she couldn't quite name. Not pride, not exactly, but something in the same family. The feeling of a person who is useful to someone in a way that matters. The deed came back from the county on a Wednesday. Arthur Hollis sent it with a brief note that said only, "Filed and recorded. Cole and Cole. Congratulations." And underneath that in smaller writing, Cathcart's remaining surveying complaint was formally dismissed this morning. "I thought you'd want to know." Nathan read the note, handed it to Evelyn. She read it. She set it down on the kitchen table beside the deed, which she had been looking at for 5 minutes already, at both their names, printed and official and permanent, on the county record. And she felt something move through her that had no clean name in English. Something between vindication and grief and gratitude, and the particular emotion that comes when you realize you have traveled an enormous distance and you can finally stop moving and just be where you are. "Cole and Cole," she said. "Cole and Cole," Nathan said. She looked at him across the table. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. She pressed her lips together, breathed through it. "He sent me a floor," she said. 6 years of premiums quietly without telling me, because he wanted me to have something solid under my feet." She looked at the deed. "I just didn't get it until I'd already learned to stand on my own." "Maybe that was the point," Nathan said. She looked at him. "Maybe he knew," Nathan said, "that you needed to find the standing first, before the floor arrived." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, That is an extremely wise thing for a man to say before 8 in the morning. I have my moments, he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. He turned it palm up and held hers the way he always did, and they sat like that in the kitchen, with the deed between them and the morning moving through the window and the sound of the ranch alive outside. The real twist arrived that afternoon, and it wore Eleanor Briggs's face, and it came through the kitchen door with the urgency of a woman who has been sitting on information for 48 hours and has finally decided she cannot sit on it any longer. Eleanor came in without knocking, which she had begun doing 2 months ago, which Evelyn took as the highest form of acceptance Eleanor Briggs was capable of expressing, and she sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands and looked at them both with the expression of a person about to deliver something complicated. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before either of you reacts. Nathan and Evelyn exchanged a glance. Go ahead, Evelyn said. James Whitfield is leaving Raven Creek, Eleanor said. He's accepted a position in Kansas City. He leaves at the end of the month. She paused. That's not the part you need to hear. Then say the part we need to hear, Nathan said. Eleanor looked at Evelyn directly. Before he leaves, he's made a formal donation to the Raven Creek School Fund. $50, in your name. The kitchen was very still. In my name, Evelyn said slowly. He told Reverend Holt that the donation was in recognition of, and these are his exact words which the Reverend repeated to me verbatim, a woman whose example of resilience has done more for this community's character than anything I contributed during my time here. Eleanor paused again. He also asked the Reverend to make sure you knew. Evelyn sat very quietly. She thought about James Whitfield on a hired horse with his hat in his hands saying what I did to you was wrong. She thought about the calculation she'd tried to do then, whether it was genuine remorse or just regret dressed up, and how she'd been unable to tell the difference. She thought she could tell now, not because $50 and a quoted sentence changed the fundamental nature of what he'd done, but because a man who is performing remorse for his own benefit doesn't make a public donation in the name of the woman he wronged to the community she lives in when he is about to leave that community forever. That was an act with no audience except the person it was meant to reach. He didn't have to do that, she said. No. Eleanor agreed. He didn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good for him, and she meant it. Eleanor stayed for an hour, and the conversation moved away from James Whitfield and into the easier territory of spring planting plans and the Halverson family's new baby, and the question of whether the Methodist minister had finally found his footing in the community after the rocky start of his first winter. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, Evelyn realized that this was what a life actually was. Not the dramatic moments, not the crisis points, not the morality complaints and the legal filings and the confrontations at the fence line. Those things were real and they mattered and they had shaped her. But the life was this people at a kitchen table, coffee getting cold, the ordinary texture of days that had been built into something worth having. She had wanted a home. She had thought home meant a house and a husband and a future with a shape she could describe in advance. She understood now that home was something else entirely. It was the accumulated weight of choices made in the direction of your own truth. It was work done honestly and relationships built carefully, and the willingness to stay when staying was hard. It was Nathan's hand turning palm up on the kitchen table. It was Eleanor's hat on the hook by the door. It was Thomas with a borrowed book held in both hands. It was her name on a deed beside the name of a man who had stopped on a road and asked the one question that mattered. After Eleanor left, Evelyn put on her coat and went outside. Spring was coming. She could feel it in the quality of the air, still cold, still with the edge of winter in it, but underneath that edge, something loosening, something preparing to open. She walked to the south wall of the house. The rosebush. She had been monitoring it through the winter with the particular vigilance of someone who has made a promise. Every hard freeze she had checked the burlap frame. Every warm spell she had looked for signs of movement too early, the kind that fooled plants into waking before it was safe. She crouched down and carefully lifted the corner of the burlap. The canes were dark and dormant, but at the base of the oldest cane, barely visible at the soil line, was the swelling of a bud. Small, tight, green, alive. She held the burlap gently and looked at that small green swelling and felt something move through her with the full quiet force of a river that has been moving underground for months and has finally found its way to the surface. "She's coming back," Nathan said behind her. She hadn't heard him come out. She didn't turn around yet. "She never left," Evelyn said. "She just needed covering." He came to stand beside her, and they both looked at the base of the rose bush in the early spring light. "Margaret planted it the first spring we were here," he said. "She said every home needed something that came back year after year, something you could count on." "She was right," Evelyn said. "She was right about most things," he said. "It's one of the things I try not to find annoying." Evelyn laughed, a real laugh, soft and surprised. She stood up and turned to face him. He was looking at her with those gray eyes, and in them she could see the full accounting of the last 7 months every morning, every fence post, every difficult conversation, every moment in the hallway, and the barn, and the kitchen, and the county lawyer's office. All of it present in his face, held there with the quiet permanence of things that have been chosen and kept. "Nathan," she said. I want to tell you something." "You're going to tell me anyway," he said. "I'm going to tell you anyway," she agreed. "In August, when I was sitting beside that road, I asked myself where someone goes when they have nowhere left." She held his gaze. "I thought I was asking a practical question. Where do I sleep? How do I eat? What do I do tomorrow? But what I was actually asking was something deeper. Whether there was a place in this world where I was supposed to be." She paused. "I know the answer now." He looked at her. "Here," she said simply. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. The gesture so habitual and specific, and his, that it lodged in her chest like something permanent. "Here," he agreed. And that was the whole of it. Not a grand declaration, not a speech built for an audience. Just two people standing beside a rosebush that had survived its winter on land, where both their names were recorded in the place they had chosen each other into being. Spring came, the way it always comes in the Colorado Territory, arriving before you're quite ready for it, changing its mind twice and then arriving for good with a certainty that makes you forget you ever doubted it. The garlic Evelyn had planted before the freeze came up in the first week of April. 12 rows straight and green, pushing through the soil with the quiet determination of things that know what they're doing. She stood in the garden and looked at them and felt the specific satisfaction of someone who planted something in faith and waited, and was not disappointed. She planted more. The tomatoes, the beans, the herbs that had come back from seed the previous year. She expanded the garden by 8 feet on the east side, which Nathan helped her mark out on a Sunday morning before church, pacing the distance and driving the corner stakes with the methodical care he brought to everything structural. Thomas came by in April with the book under his arm and a 3-page written response that he presented to her with the expression of a boy who has done something he is both proud of and terrified about. She read it at the kitchen table while he waited. It was honest. It was occasionally grammatically chaotic. It contained 2 observations about the book's main character that were sharper than anything his teacher had likely offered him, and 1 conclusion that was wrong, but arrived at through genuine reasoning, rather than guessing which was more interesting than being right by accident. She told him all of this, specifically, without softening the grammar and without undervaluing the sharp observations. He listened with the serious face and the working jaw of a boy taking something seriously. "Can I borrow another one?" he said when she finished. She went to her shelf and found him too. He looked at them, looked at her. "You're going to make me write about these too, aren't you?" "Yes," she said. He sighed with the theatrical exhaustion of a 13-year-old boy who is actually delighted. "All right," he said, and went home with 2 books and the posture of someone carrying something worthwhile. Eleanor Briggs came to dinner every other Saturday through spring and into summer, and somewhere in that rhythm she stopped being a guest and became simply someone who came to dinner, which was a different thing entirely. She brought news from town the way other people bring bread as a matter of course as part of the exchange, because it was useful and because she knew her audience. What she brought in May was this: the county had completed its review of all filings touched by Cathcart's fraudulent surveyor. 6 properties had been affected. 5 of those properties had been restored to their correct boundaries. The 6th, belonging to a family named Oakes, who had lost a full quarter-acre to a manipulated line 2 years prior, had been fully restored, and the county assessor had issued a formal statement condemning the practice and announcing new oversight procedures for all survey filings. Roy Cathcart's name appeared nowhere in the official statement, but everyone in Raven Creek knew whose surveyor it had been. "He's been very quiet," Eleanor said, sipping her coffee with the composure of a woman who finds certain silences extremely satisfying. "He'll find another angle eventually," Nathan said. "He might," Eleanor agreed. "But the next time he tries to file anything with the county, every clerk in that office is going to look at it twice." She looked at Evelyn. "And the next time anyone in this territory thinks about filing a morality complaint against a woman doing honest work, they're going to remember how that went for the last 7 people who tried it." Evelyn picked up her cup. "They withdrew," she said. "Most of them." "All of them," Eleanor corrected. "Eventually. But what people remember is not the withdrawal. They remember the woman who didn't flinch." She set her cup down. "You didn't flinch, Evelyn. Not once. That's what they remember." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I flinched. Privately. Every time." Eleanor looked at her. "But you didn't do it publicly," Eleanor said, "which is the only part that counts." Nathan looked at Evelyn across the table. She looked back at him, and in his gray eyes, she saw the acknowledgement of everything Eleanor had just said. The 7 months of it, the full accumulated weight of a woman who had been frightened and had not performed the fear, who had been hurt and had not performed the wound, who had built and built and built with the quiet insistence of someone who has decided that what she makes with her hands is more real than what other people say about her. "To the woman who didn't flinch," Nathan said quietly. It was not a toast. He didn't raise a cup. He just said it plainly the way he said everything true. Evelyn looked at him. "To the man who didn't keep riding," she said. Eleanor Briggs looked between them with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things in 60 years and knows when she is looking at something worth seeing. She picked up her cup. She didn't say anything. Some moments are completed by silence. Years later, when people in Raven Creek told the story, and they did tell it, the way small towns preserve the stories that mean something, passing them from the people who were there to the people who came after, what they remembered was not the morality complaint or the Cathcart land dispute or even the wedding on a Thursday in December. What they remembered was a woman sitting beside a road in an ivory dress with a crushed bouquet in her hands and nothing in the world to her name, and a man who stopped his horse, removed his hat, and asked the one question that mattered. And what they remembered about her answer was not the word itself, not the quiet, direct no that she had given him, but what came after it. The 7 months of after. The garden and the fence line and the accounts and the legal filings and the confrontations and the choices and the slow, deliberate construction of a life that belonged to her entirely. They remembered that the abandoned bride became the woman who couldn't be moved, that the woman with nothing became the woman who built something, that the woman who had been told in 100 ways, large and small, that she was not enough, not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not worth staying for, had looked at all of that and decided with the calm certainty of a person who has found solid ground that the people saying it were wrong. Thomas grew up and became a school teacher in the valley, and years later he would tell his students about a woman who had once handed him a book and demanded his honest opinion and refused to accept anything less, and he would tell them it was the first time in his life he'd understood that his mind was worth something. He kept both names on a list in his desk drawer, Evelyn Cole and Nathan Cole, the way some people keep the names of people they owe a debt they can never fully repay. Clara, Eleanor's niece from Denver, came back to Raven Creek the following summer with a different posture than the one she'd left with, and sat at Evelyn's kitchen table for an afternoon, and said something that Evelyn would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward. "When I left here in February, I thought what you had was luck. That the right man had happened to ride by at the right moment and everything worked out." She paused. "I understand now that it wasn't luck. It was what you did after." "What did I do after?" Evelyn asked. Clara looked at her steadily. "You decided you were worth the effort," she said. "Everything else followed from that." Evelyn sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's the whole of it." On a morning in late August, exactly 1 year after a 12-year-old boy had walked down a church aisle with a letter in his hands and changed the course of Evelyn Carter's life, she stood beside the rosebush on the south wall of the house and looked at it in full bloom. Margaret's rosebush, red and thorned and extravagant, spilling over its frame in the particular way of things that have been suppressed for too long and given the right conditions will not be contained. Nathan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. Neither did she for a moment. Then she said, "1 year." "1 year," he said. She looked at the roses. "Do you know what I thought about that afternoon on the road, while I was sitting there?" "Tell me," he said. "I thought about my mother," she said. "She died when I was 11. And before she died, she told me something I didn't understand until now. She said, 'Evelyn, the bravest thing you will ever do is decide you deserve good things.' And then she said, 'Most people never do.'" She paused. I didn't understand what she meant. I thought she was talking about being grateful, about not being greedy, about some kind of spiritual discipline. "And now," Nathan said. She turned to look at him. "Now I know she was talking about this," she said. "About standing in a place you've built and believing you have a right to be in it. Not because someone gave it to you, because you built it." She looked at the roses. She knew. Even when I was 11 years old, she already knew that this was going to be the thing I had to learn. Nathan looked at her with the gray eyes that she would spend the rest of her life reading and still finding new things in. "She raised you right," he said quietly. "She did," Evelyn said. "And so did my father in his way. They both gave me things I couldn't access until I needed them." She took Nathan's hand. He turned his palm up and held hers. They stood like that in the morning light beside the rose bush in full bloom on land, where both their names were carved into the county record in permanent ink, in the life they had built together from a dirt road and a stopped horse, and a question asked and answered in the last light of an August afternoon. Evelyn Carter had come to this place with nothing, no home, no family, no floor beneath her feet, and no ceiling she could claim. She had built all of it, not because someone saved her, not because luck placed her in the right story at the right moment, but because she had decided, sitting in the dirt in a wedding dress, calculating with the clear, cold mind of a woman who could not afford illusions, that she was going to build something real or die trying. She had built it board by board, and row by row, and choice by choice, and it was hers, and she was its, and no letter with careful handwriting, and no anonymous complaint with 7 cowardly signatures, and no man with a checkbook and a better offer could reach it now. She was not the abandoned bride. She was never going to be the abandoned bride again. She was Evelyn Cole, and her name was on the deed, and the roses were in bloom, and the man beside her had his hand turned palm up holding hers, and all of this was exactly where she was supposed to be.